This is episode 54 of the 99 Forever podcast. I'm Eric Friesen, and my guest tonight is making his third appearance on the podcast. He's a writer with the Cult of Hockey, Bruce McCurdy. Bruce, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Eric, how are you tonight?
I'm good. You know, it's good to chat with you again. How was your summer?
Oh, very good, actually, for the most part. I mean, it's still COVID world, you know, and it's a lot of flat screen, but I get out into the real world every day. I got a walking regimen that I stick to as a central core of my existence these days. It gets me out into the three-dimensional fresh air world for an hour and a half a day. And that's keeping me more or less sane.
I think I remember hearing you mention on Low Tide's show, maybe it was over a year ago, that you haven't missed a day in the pandemic.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, I recently hit 1,000 days in a row, and that was yeah. So I'm up to, after today, I think 1,028, and it's occurred to me that the Edmonton Elks have not won a home game on any one of those days.
That's a
not
tough
put the
break.
Pressure on, but that's a long time, Elks. I can tell you from personal experience, 1,000 days is a long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not an Edmonton Elks fan, but I am a fan of Edmonton sports too. So I hope that for your city and the fan base that drought won't go on too much longer.
Right on. No, that's time for that to end for sure.
And Bruce, because the Oilers made it to the Western Conference Final last year, it's a much shorter offseason than we've been used to over the past 16 years. Are you starting to get the itch for hockey to be back?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we go through our emotions at the Cult of Hockey every summer, but this year we didn't do. Usually, we do player reviews, or we used to always do player reviews of all the regular players for the season. And this year, we just didn't have time to do all those. We did a few of sort of key players that might be on the move, you know, or on the way out, or at least at a critical turning point. But once the playoffs ended, I mean, the Stanley Cup Finals was the next series, and then the draft was already right away after that. And then we got into our August routine of doing the top prospects, and we're just counting that down. We're just getting down to number 1 tonight, and I'm going to write the series wrap for that tomorrow night, and as a sort of a preview of the Young Stars Classic in Penticton that starts Friday, and then it's going to feel like hockey.
And for anyone who hasn't checked out the series yet, I've been reading your posts, and I just want to know, will you give us a spoiler of who is number 1?
Well, there's only one guy left, so this is a real spoiler. It'll come out tonight anyway. Probably David will have his post up before this podcast goes. So unless you can shut me up quicker than that, but it's going to be Philip Broberry who's number 1, and in a squeaker over Dylan Holloway.
I mean, when you're looking at 2 first-round picks that were both taken in the top 15, it's pretty close there. I mean, you're really having to compare a forward to a defenseman, but I would say at this stage, I would probably give the edge to Broberg as well.
Yeah, and then there's Stuart Skinner at number 3, and then 2 more first-round picks in Xavier Bourgault, a number 22 pick, and then the young fellow from this year, Reed Schaefer, a number 32 pick. So that's in the top 5, 4 first-round draft choices. And bear in mind that to be eligible for our list, you can't have played in 25 NHL games yet. So this idea of Ken Holland taking it slow with young players, it's true. He does.
Well, let's hope that what Ken Holland is building is similar to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And Bruce, it's the 35th anniversary of the Oilers' 1987 Stanley Cup victory, as well as the 1987 Canada Cup. So let's start with the Oilers' quest to reclaim the Cup in 1987. And unfortunately, that journey began with a shocking elimination the previous spring by the rival Calgary Flames, when Oilers rookie defenseman Steve Smith accidentally banked the puck off Grant Fuhr's leg and into his own net in Game 7 of the 1986 Smythe Division Final. Bruce, after winning back-to-back Stanley Cups in 1984 and 1985, how much criticism did the Oilers face after that devastating loss to the Flames in 86?
Well, they faced criticism on a number of fronts. There was, this idea that somehow they were fallible when it seemed like, I mean, the previous year is still considered the team of the century in terms of the NHL's voting on that subject on their 100th anniversary. And the idea that they would get beaten by anybody anytime soon seemed almost laughable. And Calgary Flames, I mean, they did have a good team. They had a real good coach. He had a real good game plan. They played Edmonton hard, right? They couldn't skate with Edmonton for speed, but they sure could skate with them in races to the puck and battles, and they gave the Oilers everything they could handle, and the series came down to who's going to get the break. And I mean, obviously Calgary did get it in a very unexpected and tragic, frankly, way to decide anything of that import. I mean, the Oilers were that goal away from winning 5 Stanley Cups in a row, and tying Montreal Canadiens' all-time record is one takeaway from it. Another takeaway is that without that loss, maybe they wouldn't have had the impetus to come back hard the way they did the following 2 years to make it 4 out of 5. But there was a story in Sports Illustrated there in June of 86, or May of 86 even, that casts some Oilers in a bad light. And there was rumors of partying and certain types of drug abuse or use, at least. Use, I believe. Abuse, I don't believe, and that's there's certainly a significant difference between that. But they were party type guys. They had a lot of fun playing the game, and I'm sure that fun didn't end when the game was over. And they had a lot of sort of swashbuckling characters on that team, and some of them got into trouble at various points in their career. And Glenn Sather had a hard and fast rule that when you do get into trouble, your first phone call is to me, and he would be the fixer, right? The cleaner would be Glenn Sather. So we probably don't know the half of the stories that went on, but on the other hand, this is a small community in Edmonton, and a lot of people went to Barry T's, so so at least not everybody had a damn cell phone that was taking video of it.
Right.
Anytime somebody got out of line, but it was the boys could do. There was very little they could do wrong in this town by the time they'd won those 2 Stanley Cups, and they were huge megastars right across the hockey world. Let's face it. I mean, that team was absolutely one of the great teams of all time. In fact, like say, the greatest team of all time, according to the NHL itself, was the 85 Oilers. So to lose in 86 the way they did, and losing 3 home games in that series, and they never once had the lead in that series. By that I mean they never had a nose in front. The only games they won were games 2, 4, and 6 when they were trailing in the series. They got the leads in those games, but all that would ever do was win them the game and even the series. And in games 1, 3, 5, and 7, Calgary scored first. Edmonton tied it up a couple times. They tied it up in game 7 with a 2-goal comeback to tie it 2-2. But they never once got their nose in front in that series, and it was always. I had a bad feeling about that series from the beginning, and it just never went away. Calgary was, they were kind of like what Dallas Eakins said about Will Acton, the smell that won't leave the room. And on top of that, they were really, they were probably the opponent I hated the most in all the time that the Oilers have been in the NHL. That team with Neil Sheehy and Paul Baxter and Gary Suter all on defense.
Yeah.
Mike Vernon in net, guys up front like Jim Poplinski, Doug Risebrough. That was not a fun opponent to play against. And there were some dirty players on there. And then there was the deal of Cliff Fletcher after 85, after the Oilers cleaned up in the playoffs and scored a bunch of goals on 4-on-4s, changed the rules. Cliff Fletcher said, well, these guys are too good. We can't have that. Let's change the rules. So let's make it so that there's no more 4-on-4. If there's a double penalty, then you just stay 5-on-5. And the league passed the rule. And sure enough, in that series, Calgary gooned it up quite a little bit with the guys that I mentioned already. And every time there was a double penalty, which is quite a few times, instead of being 4-on-4, it'd be 5-on-5. And I made kind of a habit all that year because I was kind of pissed about that. Just as a hockey fan, I thought it was detrimental to the game. I thought that different manpower situations, really one of the interesting things about hockey is you have a multitude of different manpower situations. And this one took a very fundamental one out of the game, or mostly out of the game. You still got a 4-on-4 if you took one penalty and then the other team took the next penalty on a different play, but never for the full 2 minutes. And, and so that worked for Calgary, which kind of added insult to injury, or injury to insult, whichever way you want to put it, because they, part of their tactics was to literally go after the rule book, and it's more than a little frustrating that it was successful for them in the very next season after that happened. So I was not a happy camper on April 30th, 1986. So I have to admit, I left the Coliseum in a very embittered frame of mind.
I can imagine. And Bruce, that in 1985-86, the Oilers had one of their best regular seasons, finishing 56-17-7. Mm-hmm. However, because of that loss to the Flames in the playoffs, was there any doubt that summer among the fans and the media about the Oilers' chances to get back to the top of the mountain and reclaim the cup the following year?
Well, there was, I'm not sure if I call it doubt, but I certainly will say questions. And like I say, some of them were raised by Sports Illustrated. And whether valid or not, I mean, it certainly raised a cloud of doubt and suspicion. And it was certainly the challenge was set. You got to come back and you got to do it, take it all the way, and you got to win whenever that last game is. You got to win it, skate off with that cup. That's the only way you make that smell leave the room. And in a way, it still hasn't. But it's it certainly was a cleansing event to cop that cup the very next year, right in our home building again.
To bring it back to current day too, does beating the Flames in the playoffs this past spring sort of make it go away even a slight amount?
Oh yeah, that's still fun. Now it's 5-1, right? I mean, it's 5 playoff series to 1 in the 6 battles of Alberta. That was that one in '86, that anomaly in '86 is the only one that went Calgary's way.
Well, the one this year was only the second one I've been alive for, but the one in 1991, I was 2 years old, so I don't have a lot of great memories of that series. But to see that the series this year in 2022 end similar to how the 1991 did, series with an overtime goal in the Saddle Dome, was quite sweet to see.
Yeah, oh yeah, and to end the series with an overtime goal in the Saddle Dome. I mean, that's actually happened 3 times now from a Calgary perspective. In '88, the famous sweep in '88, the last game in Calgary, which was game 2 in that series, Gretzky scored a shorthanded, very famous goal over Mike Vernon's shoulder on a shorthanded slap shot off a Curry feed. And then in '91, of course, Tikkanen ended the series in overtime game 7 in Calgary. And then now this year, McDavid ended the series with an overtime winner again in Calgary to put them out of their misery. So that's kind of a nice hat trick of goals to reminisce on, and some pretty great players involved in those goals too.
Absolutely. And for my generation and even the generation younger than me, I think having a playoff moment like that where we got to see the Oilers beat their arch rival is something that this fan base needed for a long time, because there were so many tough years over the last 15 seasons, and to just sort of have a great playoff moment like that and to get back to the Western Conference Final was especially great, I think, for the younger fans.
Yeah, well, the Oilers beat 2 great rivals in the playoffs this year. Los Angeles Kings, they've provided plenty of pain for us over the years. The '82 weak-kneed Wimps series, of course, the acquisition by the Kings of Gretzky in '88 and their subsequent beating of the Oilers in 7 games in '89. And the Oilers, they met 4 years in a row immediately after that trade in the playoffs. And the Oilers won in '90, '91, and '92. But that first series that the Kings won, and they've caused a lot of misery. During the decade of darkness, the Kings were one of the teams that were constantly laying it to the Oilers just physically pounding on him, out shooting him 45-22, winning 5-1. And there's just so many games like that. To beat the Kings and to do it in a dramatic fashion with McDavid scoring the huge goal at the end of that series and the celebration that he showed then. And then, of course, to do the same in the final game against Calgary, again with McDavid being the central player, and again an almighty celebration which had to lift the hearts of any Oilers fan. Whether those hearts are beating or not, there's probably a few long-time Oil fans that got a jolt of satisfaction.
Oh, without doubt.
That night. So.
All right, Bruce. Well, I'm sure you could provide a detailed report on every player on the 1986-87 Oilers, but we'll keep it mostly to the Hockey Hall of Famers tonight, sure, which is still a fair number on this team. And I think we should start with number 99. 8 years into his NHL career, Wayne Gretzky had already established himself as the greatest offensive player in the history of the game. Gretzky won his 8th consecutive Hart Memorial Trophy as Most Valuable Player and 7th straight Art Ross Trophy as scoring champion with 183 points in 79 games in 1986-87. And while it doesn't represent Gretzky's greatest season from a points perspective, it was no less dominant than his 200-point campaigns as he captured the scoring title by an astonishing 75 points over his line mate Yari Curry. The Great One also scored a league-leading 62 goals. It was his 5th 60-goal season, which tied him with Mike Bossy for the most in NHL history. And in typical Gretzky fashion, he finished with more assists than anyone else in the league had total points that year. Bruce, this was the 5th consecutive season where Gretzky won the Art Ross Trophy by more than 70 points. Mm-hmm. No other scoring champion has ever won by even half that margin.
Right.
Is that perhaps the best way to describe Gretzky's dominance over the rest of the league at the height of his powers?
Yeah, that's certainly one way to do it. I can tell you from 1981 to 87. So we're actually discounting the scoring championship he won in 80-81, setting a new NHL points record of 164 points. But he only won it by 29 points. And he
as a 20-year-old,
were tied at the midseason mark, and then Gretzky just took off and ran away with it by 29 in the second half. And from then on, it was like every half season he would win by 30 plus points. And it was 65, 72, 79, 73, 74, 75. I mean, this is year after year, consistent domination of very nearly 1 point per game above the second best scorer in the National Hockey League.
Right.
And you used to see ridiculous stuff, and you'd see it in this season in particular, where the guy in second place, his line mate, Yari Curry, with 108 points, he would probably be closer in scoring to the guy in 200th place than he was to the guy in first, because it was just that kind of ridiculous a gap where, like you say, Gretzky had more assists than anyone else had goals by 13, and he led the league in goals. So, put those two together, it was the 5th time that he won both the goals and assist crown in 6 years, and only the previous year that he had. He went crazy for the assist record, and he got 163 assists, and he only scored 52 goals that year. So he did not win the what would have been considered today the Rocket Richard Trophy. That one year, Curry would have got that. And the other years, Gretzky won both. And, this was, you'd think, well, 62 doesn't sound like much after 4 70-goal seasons, but the scoring in the league was starting to come down. And you could see that. I mean, 183 is still a lot for first, but 108 for second is, you see players nowadays that are, putting up more points than that and losing the scoring championship, like Goodrow, Huberdeau, and Draisaitl this past year. They all had more than 108 points and didn't win the scoring title, but still Gretzky was that far ahead of the field at 183 points, and just. Absurdly good season all around. And he did struggle in the playoffs, Gretzky, this year. I mean, he led the league in scoring, as he always did in the playoffs, but only 5 goals, 29 assists, 34 points. It was a little off his usual mark. And, he got He got a concussion in the playoffs. Dale Howardchuk in the second round bounced his head off the ice, and Gretz didn't have a lot going on in the conference finals, and he was starting to wind it up again in Stanley Cup finals, but just sort of a couple of, a court below full, let's put it that way, in those playoffs. So I'm not getting ahead of myself on that comment, but he was still very much the dominant superstar in the league. I mean, you said it already, 8 Hart trophies in a row.
Right.
Played 8 years in Edmonton at that point in the league, and he won the Hart Trophy every year. That was hockey life for fans in Edmonton, who are a little older than yourself, Eric. Was we didn't know the NHL, the Hart Trophy winner on any other team but ours.
And considering that the first one he won was at age 19, it just makes it even more remarkable.
Indeed.
And Bruce, after watching Gretzky play in Edmonton for the better part of a decade by this point, were you still just as amazed by his scoring exploits and the records he was setting, or was this just what you had come to expect from number 99?
Both. Definitely both. I come to expect him to just simply be in a league of his own, and he still was, but that didn't mean that he didn't astonish us on a regular basis with some of his individual feats, within the play of, how the heck did he get that puck? How did he see that guy? How did he see that passing lane? How did he execute the pass so perfectly that it was a tap in for Curry or Coffey at the far post or what have you? And that kind of stuff was always, I learned from early age to when he was on the ice, one eye was on him. Like I wanted to know where he was. I tried wherever the puck was, or where's Wayne? Where's it going to go next? Because it seemed to always go next to him. And when it did, he didn't necessarily have it that long, but good things tended to happen very, very quickly thereafter.
Yeah, and I can imagine you saw him hundreds of times during his time in Edmonton.
500, I reckon.
500. Yeah. Do you think you could count the number of bad games he had on maybe one or two hands?
He had bad games. He had average games. And the thing that he did that was kind of shocking because of how consistently he did it was he'd have a game, you'd say, well, geez, he didn't really have the magic going on tonight because he didn't every night. And then you look at the score sheet and you have a goal and 2 assists. And I just still pump up the points just by doing the fundamental things, and of course having such snipers on his team, and of course all the critics will tell you all the worst goalies in the history of humankind. Which I got news for you: the 1980s was just like all the other decades. The National Hockey League had the best goaltenders in the world then.
That's right. I think there is a little bit of a lack of appreciation for the fact that these were the top goaltenders of the league by some modern fans. Yep. But they still have to remember that they were wearing pads that were half the size and twice as heavy as what goaltenders get to wear today. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but I would imagine the average goaltender at that time was around 5'9", 5'10", as opposed to 6'5", that's currently playing in the NHL.
Yeah, there were relatively few monster goalies. The style of goaltending was still very much the stand-up style. And I'll say Wayne Gretzky was one of the primary reasons he exposed the stand-up style as not being workable. And what he would do a lot, he scored a lot of goals just like this, where he would come into the right face-off circle and he'd cut through the middle of the ice, going kind of parallel to the goal from the right circle to the left. And he'd get the goalie move, shuffling his feet coming across the crease. And as the goalie would put his weight on his left foot, because Wayne would almost always be going left to right on this play, Wayne would just shoot the puck right along the ice, right beside his pad. And because the guy's weight was on that foot, it would take him a split second to shuffle back, and by then the puck would be by him. And you look at it and say, geez, it wasn't even a hard shot, but it was more like he passed the puck into the hole just beyond the goalie. And he had this phenomenal awareness of the physics of the opposing player, how to catch him on the wrong foot. He did it constantly, where you got the guy, turning or whatever, and Wayne would take it the other unexpected way, and the guy would just be dead in the water. And that included goalies a lot.
Definitely. And Bruce, while Gretzky was rewriting the NHL record book during the 1980s, his line mate Yari Curry was creating his own legacy as one of the best European players of all time. Curry finished second in the league in points with a 108 and tied for third in the league in goals with 54 in 1986-87. It was his fifth consecutive 100-point season and fourth straight 50-goal season. Bruce, for those who never saw him play, how important was Curry to those Stanley Cup winning teams in Edmonton?
Oh, he was phenomenal. And I've had the occasional argument with someone saying that Gretzky made Curry, and without Gretzky, Curry wasn't that much of a player, which frankly Curry himself went a long way to disproving between 1988 and 90, after Wayne left Edmonton and he kept scoring and the team kept winning. But his partnership with Gretzky, he had everything you wanted. He didn't necessarily need to have the puck. He was quite happy to sort of patrol his wing, take that, play higher on the defensive side of the puck, but materialize in the open slot for passes. Where he was the deeper player, but frequently he was the guy who started the play. Curry was just such a great defensive player, could separate opponents from the puck. And his first look always was 99. Let's get it up to 99. And that famous overtime goal against Mike Vernon is one such example. If you ever watched the replay of the first Stanley Cup win in '84 against the Islanders, Gretzky scored the first two goals from Curry and no one else, where both times Curry was responsible for getting the puck and getting it going in the right direction and on the right stick, namely Gretzky's. But it was his stick also that finished so many plays. I mean, you mentioned 4 years in a row, over 50 goals. And every year the Oilers were in the playoffs for their first 4 championships during the Gretzky years. Curry led the playoffs in goals all 4 years. All 4 years. And just always seemed to have 14, 15 goals in the playoff, 19 the one year. And he was just such a deadly shooter, and in combination with Gretzky being such a phenomenal passer, he would have high percentage shots, and he would make them count. Here, I'll give you, Eric, this is Curry's shooting percentages from 82. This was the first year he scored over 40, got 45 goals, 20.6 shooting percentage, 26.7, 26.6, 28.8, 25.6. Those are the 450 goal seasons. He shot over 25% in all 4 of those years. And then 20.8 and 20.6. We had 7 years in a row where he was over 20%. I mean, this was an elite shooter. He wasn't like a high, huge volume shooter, 200 shots a year in that range, but 55 of them would go in the net. And he did it just consistently as a finisher. So between his terrific ability as a passer, his underrated ability as a puck carrier, which we saw more of only after Gretzky left, his defensive game, his ability to separate opponents from the puck, and a big part of the Oilers team. They used to talk a lot about the transition game, the transition from defense to offense, which the Oilers excelled at. Well, if you ask me one person who personified the transition game, I see Yari Curry front and center. I remember being at a game once, someone asked me what was Curry's vital statistics, looking for 6'1", 185 or whatever, and I said 200 by 85. Because he just seemed to, he was an all-ace player and a wonderful player, and such a gracious man. He was quite happy sort of being the second fiddle. Yeah. Because he was second fiddle on a pretty famous band, and he got his share of glory, and it wasn't all reflected glory. He earned all the credit he got, and then some. He was certainly one of the great European players to ever play in this game still. And at that stage, of course, he was still in sort of the early generations of that. He's the first real Finn to achieve such a high level, and really still Timo Solani, and I'm not sure there's many others that are in the conversation. I mean, he was just the 10 years he was in Edmonton, just fantastic. 10 years, 1,043 points, 104 points per year.
That's not bad at all over the course of a decade. And Bruce, you mentioned what a fantastic defensive player Kurri was, which allowed Gretzky to concentrate on offense. But because he was such a fantastic goal scorer, do you think that Kurri was often overlooked for the complete game he played?
I do. I think he should have won the Selke Trophy, and he probably should have won it more than once. And especially now, they like crediting offensive players and the two-way players for the Selke. Well, he was all of that, and he was just an absolutely wonderful penalty killer. Kurri was, and he and Gretzky were just so deadly on the PK, and they played as a pair a lot, and they scored a whole lot of points on the power play. Check now on his career. Kurri had 31 shorthanded goals, 35 shorthanded assists, and he was, and that's 5, 3, 6, 5, 3, 5. This is consecutive years, like 5 a year kind of thing, and he was the guy Oilers say they would choose in a 3-on-4 or 3-on-5 penalty kill. If the Oilers were only one forward on the PK, and it would be Kurri, even though he was in the center, and so he might be at a disadvantage in the circle, but he played such a almost perfect, flawless positional game that he could adapt to any situation. Man advantage, man disadvantage, 4-on-4, no worries. He was always where you wanted him to be and needed him to be.
Without a doubt. All right. Playing for his hometown team, Mark Messier became one of the best power forwards in hockey history and the heart and soul of the Oilers dynasty. Messier would have been the first-line center on most teams across the league in the mid-1980s, but because he played on the same team as Gretzky, he was the second-line center in Edmonton. Messier finished third in the league in assists with 70 and tied for third in the league in points with 107 in 1986-87, which were both career highs for him at the time. And while he was a tremendously talented player, Messier was a dominant force both physically and on the score sheet, wasn't he, Bruce?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, he was a real wild card in that he would lead the way in any number of ways. He was kind of an emotional leader of the team, certainly. And often it would be on the nights where things weren't going well that he would fire up the old engine and try and get the tide turned. He was a big time scorer. I mean, 37 goals that year he had 50 and 48 goals early in his career when he was playing left wing. But it was his conversion from left wing back into the middle of the ice to his natural center position in the spring of 84, that led to the first Stanley Cup win and to Mark himself winning the Conn Smythe Trophy in the playoffs that year. But he was a regular threat. He had 6 100-point seasons in his career. But what he also had was, I'm just counting here, 6, 7 100-minute penalty minute seasons as well. So he could dish it out. He was, and the bigger the game got, the more physical he became, and very much playing on the periphery of the rules. Let's put it that way.
And probably crossed it at times
when
too.
When the refs let him play, well, he would take advantage of that. Let's put it that way. And he wasn't a guy to be messed with. And by 87, this would have been after the Jamie McCown incident, where Jamie McCown of Calgary tried to run Messier through the end boards of Calgary Corral. This would be 84-85. I'm just looking at his games played. And I know he missed 10 games to the suspension he took for getting even with McCown that night. But you know what? From that night on, nobody messed with the guy at all around the league. And in some respects, he reminded me of Gordie Howe, which is tremendous praise. I would choose Howe as being the better player, but not by as much as you might have supposed at one point. And it's both guys. It took them like a couple of years to establish their space for themselves, and then once they earned the space, they really learned to take advantage of it, and put puck in the net, set goals up, but still also have that physical edge to them that made them stand out like the ultimate power forwards. And ultimately, Messier did in fact pass Gordie Howe for what was then second in the all-time scoring race. After Gretzky passed him in '89, Messier became the second person to pass Gordie Howe, and then Jaromir Jagr
in 2003,
joined the list. Yeah, it took Messier a few more years than Gretzky to get to 1851, didn't it? 14 more years.
it speaks to Gretzky's dominance that Gretzky did it before the 80s were over, and Messier got there early in the 21st century. Messier was also regarded as one of the greatest leaders in NHL history because of his intense win-at-all-costs attitude. Despite the incredible talent on the 1980s Oilers, how valuable was his ability to bring people together in the pursuit of a common goal?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what was going on in the room, but I mean, it was pretty obvious to all concerned that there was a core leadership group, and besides Gretzky, who was wearing the C and of course leading in all the statistical categories, both Messier and Kevin Lowe were seen as being really sort of core, sort of face of the team kind of guys. You want to beat the Oilers, you're going to have to go through these guys. Good luck with that. And it was, they were pretty imposing to say the least. I mean, Messier's performance in Game 4 at Chicago Stadium in 1990 was one for the ages. And of course, everyone remembers his guaranteed hat trick against his guaranteed win night against the Devils in Game 6 in '94, when Messier personally scored a hat trick in the third period to win that game. I mean, talk about putting your money where your mouth is. So he came up big in crunch time for the most part, and he always had great totals in the playoffs. Like his points per game went up in the playoffs, and most players you see that go down. The checking gets a little tighter. You're not playing so many weak sisters, and yet Mark would always be higher among the scoring leaders in the playoffs than he had been in the season. So he was a big game man for sure.
He saved his best performances for the biggest moments.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And playing alongside Messier, Glenn Anderson tallied 35 goals and 73 points in 1986-87. It was his 7th straight 30-goal season with the Oilers. But Bruce, it was the timing of those goals that cemented him as a key member of the powerhouse Oilers, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was a big time goal scorer, and he scored, and I'm sure we're going to get to it, a very famous goal in the '87 playoffs. But he was a game breaker, and a pretty mercurial, kind of unpredictable guy. But what you could safely predict was that, again, when the games got bigger, he got better. He got more focused, and he would bring not just his A game, but his A+ game. And the combination of him and Messier almost invariably on the same line as a second line for other teams to contend with after they've been, minced and diced by Gretzky and Curry. Okay, now you get to go against these guys. And Messier might put you through the boards, or Anderson might have one of those accidental sticks come up and clip you under the chin. It was the boys played for keeps. And Anderson, I mean, one of his, this isn't recognized as a record, but I recognize it as a record for the Oilers. He scored a hat trick, overtime hat trick, in the sense that 3 consecutive playoff overtime games for the Oilers, Anderson scored the game-winning goal for Edmonton, and it just took him, let's see if I got this right, 46 seconds, 64 seconds, and 36 seconds. So it's like a hat trick, like a minute each game. He'd put him out in the first shift, he'd score. Let's go home. And it was 3 different playoff years. Like the Oilers were dominant enough, they didn't need to go to overtime very often.
Right.
So it was like 85, 86, and 87. I think he scored an overtime winner in each of those years. That was in success, in consecutive games from the Oilers' perspective. That he broke them up, and he did so fast.
Oh, for sure. And after winning back-to-back Norris trophies as the best defenseman, Paul Coffey was limited to just 59 games in 1986-87 due to a back injury. However, he still managed to put up 67 points, but it was a significant drop from his 48-goal and 138-point season a year earlier. Bruce, how big of a boost did it give the Oilers to get Coffey back after missing a quarter of the season?
Yeah, he was in and out, as I recall. I mean, he missed a bunch of time at once, but when he came back, it seemed like he was never quite 100%. And there were sort of question marks: will he go or won't he? And he'd been taking a pounding for a few years by then, of course. But this was a back injury, and wonky backs are difficult things to deal with. And he'd scored. Not just 138 points the year before, but 121 the year before that, and 126 the year before that. So just a fantastic 3 straight 120-point seasons. I mean, not even Bobby Orr did that.
And he was second only to Gretzky in scoring in 84.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So he was a big-time offensive defenseman. I've heard some people saying that Chris Pronger was the best defenseman Oilers ever had, and I think in the fullness of time, and I like Chris Pronger plenty in terms of what he did for the Oilers, in terms of his sort of natural sort of defensive game, doing everything in the book and doing it well. But Coffey was kind of one of these outside the mold guys, and he brought so much offense to the game that made up for the occasional foible on defense. And I mean, he was a big-time outscorer. He was plus 50 4 years in a row. Plus 50 4 years in a row. And so he was. He too was a threat on the penalty kill. He was a huge, gigantic threat on the 4-on-4. That was where he particularly would bury the other team. Just envision any situation where the other team comes in on a 2-man rush, Shearer Moog makes the save, or the shot goes wide, the puck comes up the boards, and you've either got Gretzky and Curry, or you've got Messier and Anderson coming back on the ice on 2-on-2, except you got Paul Coffey blasting up the middle of the ice to make it a 3-on-2. And how do you like your chances? I liked them fine. The puck wound up in the net a lot. And he was a big part of that. He wouldn't necessarily be the scorer, but he would be the guy that would overload and sort of create the odd man advantage, create the puzzle and the problem for the defensive players, and to do that at 100 miles an hour. Such a phenomenal skater he was. That he just chewed up the ice, end to end. Talk about full length of the ice. I would match him up against certainly any defenseman in terms of end-to-end speed.
Right. Do you recall who stepped up and played more of an offensive role with him out on the blue line for a large chunk of that season?
Well, it was a little bit before Steve Smith, who ultimately became the Oilers' power play quarterback and put up a couple of 50 points plus seasons. Coffey, even in this bad season, was 67 points in 59 games. Not bad. But Kevin Lowe had some decent sort of secondary offense. Randy Gregg had some decent secondary offense. But mostly it was the forwards that carried the scoring load in 86-87. Who you got in mind particularly? Reijo Ruotsalainen at the end of the season.
Mm-hmm.
Points in 16 games, not bad.
And Bruce, speaking of Kevin Lowe, on a team stacked with offensive superstars, Lowe established himself as a rock on the Oilers' defense, and as the most competitive blue liner, he would punish opponents in front of the net and in the corners while still putting up 37 points in 1986-87.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the Oilers were scoring 400 goals per season for half of the 80s, how important was it for them to have a player like that who was just solely concentrated on defense?
Well, he certainly was. That was his. That was his sort of claim to the team, was his defensive play. He actually entered the team as a first-round draft choice, the first in the history of the Oilers, as something of an offensive hotshot in Quebec, and he adapted his game to, and he sort of realized early on, he looked around and he said, we got a few guys that are probably going to put a lot more pucks in the net than I do, but I don't see too many guys that are that defensive oriented. That's what the team needs. That's what I'm going to do. And that was the impression that we got at the time. And I think he pretty much said as much, that, his first priority was keeping the puck out of Oilers' net. But he certainly was a threat to score, and he was a threat to score at important times. If the Oilers were blowing some team out, he was content to hang back and just chip the puck up and clear the zone, make the headman pass. But if they were down 3-2, 4 minutes left in the third period, and all of a sudden some guy materializes off the blue line that no one's expecting because he doesn't usually do this, that'd be Kevin Lowe. There's some sorts of art in his game to be, and again, that's a huge compliment coming from him.
Oh, yeah.
I thought Savard was an absolutely wonderful player.
Definitely. And in goal, Grant Fuhr posted a 22-13-3 record in 14 games in 1986-87, finishing third in voting for the Vezina Trophy as best goaltender. This was also his last season, splitting the time with Andy Moog between the pipes. And Fuhr was always a goalie that cared more about winning than his individual numbers. But as good as he was in the regular season, Bruce, Fuhr consistently elevated his game in the playoffs, didn't he?
Very much so. He was another one of these guys that would, as the games get bigger, he would elevate. And he was always in the sort of mentions of being a possible, in contention for the Conn Smythe in the playoffs, because he'd be a big part of the team along the way. But invariably, he would play second fiddle or third fiddle to Gretzky or Messier, or that one year that Coffey was involved. But they would talk about Fuhr's ability to deliver in the crunch. I remember one year he was first star of the first 4 playoff games in a row.
Oh, wow.
And sort of got, as a team was sort of getting up to speed, he was keeping them in and winning games for them, and then they took off.
I mean, that's even more remarkable on a team. Yeah, I mean, when you think about how much talent they had at that time, for the goaltender to be the first star 4 games in a row, it just kind of speaks to how well he was playing.
Yeah, well, they swept the Kings that year, 85, in the first round, 3-game best-of-5 series, and he was the dominant player in that series. But he was he raised his game in the crunch, and I mean, he was coming up towards his his greatest season would have been 87, 88. But like you say, in 86, 87, he was still sharing time with Andy Moog. Moog actually had the better one-loss record in the season, and their save percentage, goals against, were almost saw off. But Sather preferred Fuhr in the playoff games, I think in part because he was a significantly better puck handler, and very good at fielding pucks, hard shootings and so on around the boards, and very proficient with the stick, making outlet passes or just getting the puck in a good place where a teammate could deal with it. Whereas Moog was very much kind of a stick to your net guy, and maybe go out and sort of field a shoot around, but just leave it for the defenseman as opposed to making any kind of play with it. I think that had some impact on Sather, but I just think he thought Fuhr had je ne sais quoi that's going to come through for you when it matters most. And Steve Smith might say, why was his leg sticking out from the net? That would be a very good question. But in general terms, I mean, he was the man for the first 4 of those cups. He played the entire finals in 3 of them, and only
Andy Moog was the first one, right?
Moog finished the series. Fuhr started it with a shutout in Long Island, but then he got hurt. He got hit and he got hurt. And Moog finished it up. So that was a true 2-goalie playoffs.
Yeah, and even before Moog moved on, did you think eventually one of them would just become the full-time starter and play 60-plus games a year, or did you see this tandem going on for years to come?
Well, tandem was so darn effective. We didn't really want to see anything change with it. I mean, Fuhr and Moog during the season, like as a fan, I was totally comfortable with either guy in net. Like the Oilers' chances to win every night, and many more nights than not, they had the better goalie. And there was one or more seasons where the 2 of them both went to the All-Star game, and they were the 2 Campbell Conference goaltenders, both on the same team. It doesn't happen often, but they really did split. It was basically a one-on, one-off. Was say their standard. Every once in a while, he'd shake things up, but come playoff time, you could be confident that Grant would be the man in game 1, and chances were very good he'd be the man in game 19 or 21 or however many it took to win it that year. And so he eventually that chafed on Moog, and when in 87 playoffs he didn't get much of a chance and his contract was expired, and that was the time that he was ready to move on. And at that, he went to play for the Canadian Olympic team in Calgary in the 88 Olympics. And only after the Olympics were over was the trade made, where he went to Boston, and Billy Ranford came over to Edmonton. So even that trade worked out pretty well. Jeff Courtnall, not a bad player as a throw-in in that trade.
For sure.
And so that worked out in the end. And Moog went on. He had a good career elsewhere, but he was, if there was a 1 and 1A in Edmonton, well, he was the 1A, and Grant was the 1. When time came, and ultimately that led to, but for really 83 to 87 as a tandem, phenomenal. They were both outstanding.
For sure. And speaking of trades, I want to ask you about 2 noteworthy deals from the 1986-87 season. Mm-hmm. The Oilers weren't only known for having some of the most talented players in the world at this time, but some of the toughest in the league as well. And Dave Semenko would easily be at the top of that list. So after playing parts of 10 seasons with the Oilers in the NHL and WHA, Semenko was traded to the Hartford Whalers on December 12, 1986 for a 3rd-round pick in the 1988 NHL draft. Bruce, Semenko is best remembered as Wayne Gretzky's bodyguard, but for fans outside of Edmonton who didn't get to watch Semenko play for a decade like you did, what did he mean to the Oilers during the glory years?
He meant a lot, and he was, talk about glory years, I was lucky enough that I first took out season tickets in the fall of 77 when the Oilers were a very mediocre team in the World Hockey Association. And they had Glenn Sather just moving from player coach to full-time coach behind the bench, and he was the early forerunner of the champion teams. But in terms of players on the ice, the very first player who would ultimately win the cup here to arrive in Edmonton as an Oiler was Dave Semenko, about a month into that 77-78 WHA season. And he won a lot of hearts in this town. Of course, hockey in the WHA in the late 70s was not for the faint of heart. It was a pretty goony league, and there was a few. This was around the time of Slapshot, and some of those characters literally played in the league. Louis Levasseur, he was the goalie in Slapshot. He played for the Oilers. Steve Carlson, who was one of the Hanson brothers, he played for the Oilers.
Right.
And around the league, there was Ogie Oglethorpe. He's based on a minor league legend player named Goldthorpe. And, there was some pretty strong connections. But just the hockey in general, it was like fights are part of the entertainment package. It's like roller
Yeah.
derby, and it was, this is how the game is packaged. And, Semenko, he was a real powerhouse fighter, for sure. He had what was then a new technique. Instead of throwing gloves down on the ice, he would throw them up. And when you realize Semenko was in a fight, when you see the gloves flying in the air, because he'd bring up his hands, of course, his fists, when the gloves came up. So it was none of this throw down, then bring the hands back up. He was already up and ready to go. He often had the early jump on the guy, and if he got the first one or two in, then the other guy was in serious trouble.
He didn't lose many fights, did he?
No, he lost a couple. Ben Wilson beat him one time, and there was, a few draws and that along the way, but it was more a matter of deterrence. And I mean, this was a lot of talk in the day, and there was some truth of it, and some of it is rationalizing it, but there's some truth in it that players really didn't want to face the wrath of Dave Semenko, and legend had it he would, when things were getting rowdy, he'd just go out and go for a skate on the ice and find the main man from the other team and ask him if he wanted to go for a canoe ride. And often the game would settle down immediately without the canoe ride, and it would just be, addressed verbally. And that would be that, because he was a pretty imposing character at 6'3" and 220 maybe. I'm trying to remember exactly what he was, but he was what he was in 86, 87 was very near the end of the line.
Right.
And he'd only played 5 games, I think, that season. It was December at the time of the trade. But what basically had happened is Marty McSorley had won his job. And Marty McSorley was a younger guy with more sort of fundamental game and a very sort of ferocious, aggressive guy, very big, strong guy. And Sather decided after the loss in 85, 86 to Calgary, where both of them were playing, that was maybe one too many. So Sammy was the coach's decision quite a few nights, and then they moved him on for basically to extend his career. I think they did him solid at that point.
Mm-hmm. And Bruce, just because it's timely, the Oilers recently announced their own Hall of Fame as part of their 50-year celebration. And the 7 players that we already talked about, who all have their banners hanging at Rogers Place, are automatically inducted into the Oilers Hall of Fame, but they will be naming 2 more later this month. I don't know if Semenko will be one of those original ones, but would you see him as a strong candidate to eventually be inducted into the Oilers Hall of Fame?
To eventually be inducted? Absolutely, I do. And he may be on the early end of that list, in part due to the misfortune that he's passed on a few years ago, and people want to remember him and have reason to remember him positively. Certainly, he put up nothing in the way of statistics that says this guy is even an outer circle Hall of Famer. But I think in terms of his role within the team, both on the ice, but in the room, on the road trips, big fellow, timely sense of humor, apparently had the ability to crack up the room at times when things were getting tense. And sometimes that's what you really need. And I do know for statistics, he had 5 goals and 5 assists in the 1984 Stanley Cup playoffs when he played quite a bit of time with Gretzky and Curry. And boy, did that solve a few problems when they all of a sudden had 4 lines deep that they were able to go. Nobody in the end could handle him, but that was the hockey. Dave played the hockey of his life during those playoffs. It was sad to see him go, but it was time. So ultimately, we thought this, something's got to give. And when the news came out, well, it only makes sense.
It seemed like Sather really was a father figure to this group because they were such a young team and he was a young coach, but he was also a guy who would move a player along when they were no longer able to help the team the way they once had.
Yeah, and every summer he'd make like 2 or 3 changes, and just some of it would be tinkering, around the edges. He'd bring in, different players with, skilled players on, the second line. He might have, he went from having Willie Lindstrom on the wing, and when he lost him, he brought in Mark Napier, and when he lost him, he brought in, you're probably going to ask me about Kent Nilsson, that wound up in the playing with Messier and Anderson. These guys were third wheel, and what they all had in common was skill.
Yeah. And
when they were put in a place where, they weren't expected to, sort of carry the scoring and create the goals, but they were just, opportunists. And, when the chance arises, you make that shot or that pass, and good things are going to happen. And Sather was, he was a master at just working around the edges, but adding wingers or bottom sixers who could help. And without very often until the end of the dynasty, really giving up on a player was central to the core. A couple of exceptions with Coffey and I'd argue Moog, where money eventually talked in both cases. But he would change. He traded Ken Linseman for Mike Krushelnyski, for example. Ken Linseman had been a hero on the '84 Cup team. Well, all Mike Krushelnyski did in '84-'85 was be part of the highest scoring line in NHL history when he filled in on the first line with Gretzky and Curry. Well, that's a dream job, and he made the most of it. And he was a master at just making these small deals. Getting Kevin McClelland out of Pittsburgh, right? I mean, who's Kevin McClelland? Oh, that guy.
Yeah.
Getting Marty McSorley out of Pittsburgh. He couldn't make a terrible non-playoff team, but he came into Edmonton, won a Stanley Cup as a right winger in 1987, and won another Stanley Cup as a right defenseman in 1988. Tell you what, there's a short list of players who've done that.
Yeah. And Bruce, you just mentioned Kent Nilsson a while ago, so that's a perfect time to transition to talking about him. So on March 2nd, 1987, the Oilers actually picked up Kevin Nilsson for cash. So you can call it a trade or a sale, whatever you want. Nilsson closed out the season with 17 points in 17 games following the trade to Edmonton. And Bruce, the Oilers already had the best line in the NHL with Gretzky, Curry, and Esa Tikkanen, and now they were adding Nilsson to an already supremely talented second line with Messier and Anderson, a line that would have been better than most teams' first lines in the NHL. How well did the Magic Man fit with those two, and do you consider this one of Glenn Sather's best in-season moves as GM of the Oilers?
Well, certainly one of. Yeah, I'll buy one of. If I had to pick the best one, I'm not sure that would be it. But it was a nice sort of complimentary pickup, and they're sort of going, well, Kent Nilsson, maybe he's not the Magic Man that he was in Calgary. Or I remember him as a Winnipeg Jet in 77, 78. Came into the WHA as a rookie the same year I came in as a season ticket holder. And of course, we saw a whole lot of the Winnipeg Jets here in Edmonton. So I saw a whole lot of Kent Nilsson playing for Winnipeg. And then when they got into the NHL, they had that ridiculous reverse expansion where teams like Winnipeg got just pilloried by NHL teams like Atlanta Flames that claimed Kent Nilsson because they drafted him, even though Winnipeg had signed him. And of course, the Atlanta Flames quickly became the Calgary Flames, and the Magic Man became kind of front and center in the battles of Alberta. Usually came out second best because we had a lot more Magic Men than Calgary did. But we'll call that margin 5-1 as well. But he was the one, and he had 131 points, 49 goals, 131 points in Calgary's first NHL season, and he was a big-time player for them. And on this 87 team, he was one of 4 130-point players that the Oilers had on that team that had scored 130 plus points in a season, which is scoring champion range. Of course, Gretzky had several 200-point seasons, but Curry, Coffey were over 130, and Messier would later get to 129. So but so they just the 87 team, I would say without question, was the most skilled team Edmonton had.
Mm-hmm. And Nielsen is also the Flames' all-time single-season scoring record holder as well.
131 points, eh?
Yeah. Makes it even more satisfying that the player who holds that record for the Flames.
Yeah.
Won his only
Calgary
cup
traded him to Minnesota, and then Lou Nanne sent him on to Edmonton. All he did in Minnesota was score 106 points in 105 games. Better sell him to Edmonton.
Yeah, no kidding. Let's make the best team in the NHL even better.
Lou Nanne and Glenn Sather, they had an understanding. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Sather sent some good prospect players to Minnesota, but come the deadline, he seemed to pick up the odd gem from that team. And Kenta was definitely a gem.
One team was building for the future and the other was loading up for another run.
Yes.
All right, so the Oilers finished first in the NHL standings with a 50-24-6 record for 106 points in 1986-87, capturing back-to-back President's trophies. It was also, and it was also their second straight 50-win season and third in franchise history. The Oilers led the league in goals for the fifth consecutive season as well with 372. And in the 1987 Smythe Division semifinal, the Oilers faced the Los Angeles Kings, who finished 36 points behind them in the standings that season. However, the Oilers stumbled out of the gate in Game 1 against the Kings, didn't they, Bruce?
Yeah, they sure did. And this was when the questions came. You know, they won the President's Trophy. Well, that's expected, right? They're the best. But come the playoff time, after what happened last year, you know, against Calgary and losing those last two home games, and to come out and lay an absolute egg in Game 1 against Los Angeles was it did not land well. And I distinctly remember Tiger Williams scoring a goal for the Kings. He was king at that time. In the third period of that first game, kind of sealing the win. It was kind of a clinching goal for them. And he did that thing where he'd get on and he'd ride his stick and
the Tiger Williams?
The rodeo thing, Tiger Williams, the Tiger Williams.
Yeah.
In front of the Oilers bench. And I remember thinking, you know, they have to play the Oilers again tomorrow night. Maybe that wasn't probably the best idea. And tomorrow night came very quickly and with some gusto when the Oilers blew out of the gate with a 6-goal first period and subsequently went on to storm Los Angeles 13-3.
Yeah.
The 13 goals still is a record for most goals in an NHL playoff game. Gretzky in that game, he started the game tied with Jean Beliveau with 176 points, most points ever in the Stanley Cup playoffs. He got 1 point in Game 1 to tie Beliveau, but he was still just tied with him. Well, by the time that night was over, Wayne had a 7-point lead on Beliveau because he scored 7 points in that 13-3 blowout. And the whole Edmonton team just answered the bell and absolutely overwhelmed the Kings. And from there on, it was, you know, closer games. I think it was 6-5, 6-3 down the stretch of that series. But the Oilers came out on top each time, and they basically just had too much offense that LA could not handle them. But really, the series turned on Game 2. Sort of, we were at that point where we said, are they going to blow it in the playoffs again? Oh, here's the Oilers we know and love. Look at this. Boom, boom. And they just kept it coming. And it was fantastic. That second game was a treat to watch, even though the opponent they were playing was weak enough that it wasn't a competitive game. You know, it was just a shit kicking. That's the only way to put it.
Right. And Bruce, after dropping Game 1 to the Kings on home ice, the Oilers won the next 4 games in a row by a combined score of 30-15. And as you mentioned, that included the famous record-setting 13-3 victory in Game 2, where Wayne Gretzky passed Jean Beliveau. One thing we've talked about on a previous episode is that he never took his foot off the gas in these situations where he was close to winning a record or setting a record. He would just continue to go for the jugular. Other than the Oilers' Stanley Cup victories, I mean, I don't know if this was the most exciting game you ever attended, but was it one of the most memorable because of the record that was set that night?
Well, beating Jean Beliveau's playoff scoring record, that's a pretty big deal. You know, I mean, that's the playoff equivalent to beating Gordie Howe's regular season scoring record.
Right.
And Howe, I think, was second on that list at that time, but Belleville, played in the Stanley Cup Finals every year for the first 8 years of his career, I think, because Montreal was such a stacked team. But what most of those Habs teams didn't do until the very end of Belleville's career was play more than 2 rounds in the playoffs. So, of course, by Gretzky's era, I mean, this is still 87. He's only been in the league for 8 years, and he's already the all-time playoff scoring leader. There, in all honesty, there was lots of playoff games that were more memorable than that one, but this one is, had, for reasons. I do remember the occasion, certainly the score and some of the statistical outputs from it. But I can't tell you a whole lot about how the goals were scored. It was just, this team was better than that team. I was watching the Canadian women's team take apart Belarus or something, right? It was not really a contest. Oilers raised their game to basically their highest level. Kings couldn't match, and from then it was just a matter of playing out the series. And when they needed a goal, they got one.
And it showed how dominant the team was, that even on a night when Gretzky scored 7 points, he only contributed to just over half the amount of goals the team scored that night.
Yeah. No, the boys were firing on all cylinders, and I think Tiger Williams probably bore some of the responsibility for that. I don't
celebration.
think that sat too well.
And the Oilers had a reputation as being a cocky team themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for someone to try and show them up like that in their own building, first of all, I can imagine that Glenn Sather didn't mince words after that game in his own right, but the Oilers had enough pride themselves that they weren't going to take that lightly, and they would respond accordingly the following night.
No, they took matters into their own hands, and they just scored early enough, and then that was a statement game. That was the statement game, really, certainly of that series. And it answered a lot of questions of, the Oilers lost their edge, they lost the playoffs last year, and they got beat by the Kings in game 1, And of course, if they'd lost game 2, they would have been in serious trouble. Well, they were remotely close to losing game 2, and they were never remotely close to being in serious trouble after that in that series.
Mm-hmm. And after eliminating the Kings in 5 games, the Oilers took on the Winnipeg Jets in the 1987 Smythe Division Final. This was the 4th playoff series between the two clubs since joining the NHL in 1979. And not only were the Oilers victorious in the previous 3 series, they had never even lost a game to the Jets at this point. And that trend continued in the 1987 playoffs as the Oilers swept the Jets 4 straight to advance to the conference final for the 4th time in 5 years and extend their playoff winning streak to 8 games. And while the Jets were a talented squad in their own right, they simply couldn't handle the offensive firepower of the Oilers, could they?
No, they couldn't. And they couldn't score, with the Oilers. I mean, nobody really could, right? But they, the scores of this series, 3-2 in overtime in game 1. I think that was Anderson again. And then 5-3, 5-2, 4-2. Just Edmonton was the better team. And they, Jets gave them a game. The Jets play well. And they always seem to play well in game 3 in Winnipeg. And Edmonton would find a way to, kill them on the counterattack, typically.
Right.
And by game 4, Don Whitman, who was a tried and true Jets announcer, and he would sort of have a Jets viewpoint and things. About halfway through the 3rd period of game 4, he'd be going, well, these Edmonton Oilers are just too good for, he didn't say my Jets, but I mean,
basically
it came across. But he was, and he was a good announcer, but it was kind of that moment when he admitted defeat was always a little bit of fun in those series.
And Bruce, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, Wayne Gretzky was injured in the series, getting a concussion. Do you recall what night it was? And
it was game 4.
Okay.
And it was relatively early in the game, and there was some kind of a kerfuffle scrum And It wasn't just any job. It was Dale Howardchuck pulled Gretzky down. And to my admittedly also biased eye, I mean, I had my team. I thought he kind of bounced his head off the ice, and Wayne went off and not looking good at all.
Yeah.
And the Oilers finished that game without him, and they finished the Jets and won it 4-2. And afterwards, they got an entire week off because they'd taken care of business. So
Wayne at least had a little bit of time.
He had enough time that he was ready. They announced ready to start the next series against Detroit. And he did, in fact, start and finish and play in every game in that series, but he had 0 goals and 2 assists in a 5-game series.
Yeah. And you're convinced he wasn't at...
He was nowhere close. He was nowhere close. These were bad games for Wayne Gretzky, and there was a reason they were bad games. He was trying to play through a concussion.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know today, he wouldn't have been, I'm not sure he would have been back, frankly, in those playoffs, but he certainly wouldn't have been back a week after that happened. And I'm equally convinced the Oilers would have beaten Detroit without Gretzky, which more or less they did, because he really was a shadow of himself. And fortunately, their next sort of real tough series, he had a couple more weeks. They won against Detroit. They had a few more days off, and then by the time they played Philly, he wasn't like on top of his game though even then, but he still was a dominant player in the Stanley Cup final.
Well, let's talk about that series between the Oilers and Red Wings now. So after sweeping the Jets out of the playoffs, the Oilers faced the Detroit Red Wings in the 1987 Campbell Conference Final. This was the first ever playoff meeting between the Oilers and Red Wings. And just like in their first round series against the Kings, the Oilers came out flat in Game 1, dropping a 3-1 decision to the Red Wings on home ice. Bruce, even though the Oilers were clearly the superior team, do you think that loss slapped them to attention that they couldn't take anyone lightly once you make it this far in the playoffs?
Yeah, again, a little bit. It was they were desultory games. Detroit was they'd been the dead things for a lot of years before then, and this was just the first signs of life in Detroit. Oilers would play them in the conference final again the next year, but they were just coming around. They were defensively oriented game. I mean, scores in this series: 3-1 Detroit won, Edmonton won 4-1, 2-1, 3-2. I mean, these are not sort of your standard Oilers games. Like I was saying, Gretzky didn't get a lot done, and they were just sort of getting their way through it. I mean, Game 3, I think it was Marty McCurdy. There it is. I'm just calling up on hockey reference.com this game summary. I just remembered McCurdy scoring in the 60th minute. It was a 1-1 tie, and the series was tied 1-1. Here's Marty McCurdy, the Glen Say, their unheralded pickup from Pittsburgh, scoring a goal at 19:24, the third period. McCurdy from McTavish and Hunter. That's not exactly your big boppers there, but somehow they managed to get one when the Oilers really needed it to win that game. And once they got that basically got them home ice it back, and that was a huge sigh of relief to win that Game 3, because that was a tense game, it really was. And Gretzky was clearly struggling. And then they again won Game 4 in Detroit, but again it was just a 1-goal, low-scoring, hard-fought game. But this was sort of the low point of the playoffs for the Oilers, and like I say, that Gretzky concussion was a huge part of that. If he was, firing on his usual 8 cylinders, that they would have made shorter work of those games. It still might have gone 5, but I don't think the games themselves would have been quite as tense.
Right. So, as you said, after a tough start against the Red Wings, the Oilers responded with 4 straight victories, including a pair of tight 1-goal games on the road to advance to the Stanley Cup final for the 4th time in 5 years. Bruce, even though the job was far from over at this point, did you take any satisfaction in seeing the Oilers win their 4th Clarence Campbell Bowl, or was this just another step in the road to the Oilers reaching their ultimate goal?
Really, just another step. The Campbell Conference, conference finals, was always it was tougher to get out of the Smythe division than it was to get out of the Campbell Conference most years.
Didn't they sweep a couple opponents in the conference final?
Yes, they did. They swept Chicago in '83. They swept Minnesota in '84, and they generally made fairly short work of their conference rival, and there was never really any doubt as to which was the better team. It was just a matter of when were they going to assert themselves and prove it. And this Detroit series was it was concerning. And going into the finals, I mean, there was concern: is Wayne going to be all right? That was sort of number one. And also, these Philadelphia Flyers, this is a pretty darn good hockey team,
right?
And by this time, I mean, it wasn't just this year. It was 3 years running. 84, 85, Philly was first overall. Edmonton came second overall. 1-2 in the league in goal differential. 85, 86, Edmonton first overall. Philly second overall. 1-2 in the league in goal differential. 86, 87, this year we're talking about Edmonton number 1, Philly number 2. 1-2 in the league in goal differential. I mean, these were the two best teams in the league. One
first and second in the standings, too.
In the standings, yeah, all 3 years. 1-2 in the standings and goal differential. Same two teams. 3 years in a row, and they met in the finals in 2 of the years. These were the two best teams in hockey. But one of them was better than the other, and the Oilers proved that in both times that they actually met in the finals.
Right. And after going 12-2 through the first 3 rounds of the postseason, the Oilers met those Philadelphia Flyers in the 1987 Stanley Cup final. It was also a rematch of the 1985 final, which the Oilers won in 5 games. But Bruce, going into that 87 series, did you think the Flyers would present a greater challenge for the Oilers than the team they beat 2 years earlier?
Yes. Yeah, they were clearly a more mature. In the 85 team, that was Mike Keenan's rookie season. And he really fired up that team. And they had some young guy, Rick Tocchet was, I believe, a rookie on that 84-85 Flyers team. And
Kelly Lindbergh in goal.
Yeah. And they were starting to make noise. Well, by 87, all those guys were a couple years older, and many of them were a couple of years better. And there were some truly great players on that team. I mean, the top defense pair of Mark Howe and Brad McCrimmon, that was a sensational pairing. That were, huge plus pairing every year. And they had this, I guess, second pairing was a defensive pairing of Brad Marsh and Shell Samuelson. The skating tripod was his less than flattering nickname because he was a big, huge guy, a very lumbering skater, and it seemed like he leaned on his stick while he was skating. But you couldn't go around either of these guys, right? They both each covered half the ice, and they were, you try and put a pass through them. While between Samuelson and Marsh, it seemed like they had like 7 skates and 5 sticks. They were just in the way, constantly in the lane. And so, they had this sort of real solid, they had Doug Crossman on that defense group as well. And so they had this really solid defensive group. Kelly Lindbergh, of course, by then had passed away in a unfortunate car accident. And they did have a rookie in his spot, Ron Hextall, who had a phenomenal, probably the best season of his career, isn't it?
Won the Vezina Trophy, right?
And he won the Conn Smythe Trophy with a towering performance in the playoffs. And this was a team, they played 26 games in those playoffs. Like, there wasn't like 4 and 5 game series the way Edmonton had them. It was 6 and 7 all the way for those.
Yeah, they played 7 more games that year than the Oilers did in the playoffs.
I think it's still a record. I think Dallas Stars tied it a couple of years ago when they played here in the bubble playoffs against Tampa and lost. That they played 26 games and eventually ran out of steam in the end. And that's what that Philly team. And then they had they had a first line of Brian Propp with Pelle Eklund and Rick Tocchet. And those guys were dynamite. Like, they had it all. Like, Eklund was such a skilled puck handler and rusher and distributor. And Tocchet was this big, mean, hard-nosed power forward with the scoring touch. And Propp was a sniper and a bit of a nasty piece of work in his own uh, way that they held their own and then some, even against the Oilers. Those guys were real tough.
Definitely. All right. So in game one of the 1987 final at Northlands Coliseum, Wayne Gretzky gave the Oilers an early 1-0 lead before Brian Propp tied the game 1-1 in the second period. However, the game wouldn't stay tied for long as Edmonton completely took it over in the third period, didn't they, Bruce?
They sure did. And this was their, well, you might call them secondary scores, but secondary only to Gretzky. Anderson put him on the lead on a goal from Messier. Coffey extended the lead on a goal from Gretzky. And then Curry made it 4-1 on a goal from Messier and Coffey. Have fun with that, Philly. So it was a tight game, and then the Oilers, just their scoring depth. Gretzky, Anderson, Coffey, Curry. Well, those guys all scored, and Edmonton won 4-2. And Shearer made saves when he needed to, and Propp and Tocchet scored for Calgary. I'm just again looking at the summary right now, but it was Edmonton, and I think maybe Philly came into that with one game left, less rest. I think they had a longer series on the other side, and anyway, it was they seemed a little bit overmatched. And after game one, I was briefly confident that it might be a short series.
Mm-hmm. Not what ended up happening, though. And with an assist on Paul Coffey's game-winning goal in Game 1, Gretzky also recorded his 200th career playoff point, becoming the first player in NHL history to ever reach the milestone. And in Game 2, Gretzky scored a power play goal just 45 seconds into the opening frame to put the Oilers in front, but the Flyers responded with a pair of goals later in the period to take a 2-1 lead after 20 minutes. And following a scoreless second period, the Oilers were still trailing by 1 in the third, which set the stage for an exciting and dramatic finish to the game, Bruce.
Yeah, it sure did. My recollection is the 3 goals were all scored in the second. Yeah, they were. Gretzky scored in I think it was even a 5-on-3 in the second.
Or my mistake, I apologize. 45 seconds into the second period, I should say.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Philly took 2 penalties right in a row, right at the end of the first. And Edmonton had a 2-man advantage, and they scored. And I was at this game too, of course, all the home games. And I think I would single this out as the best game I ever saw in NHL.
Really?
Yeah, just a fantastic game. Both teams playing, giving it all that they had, and it was back and forth. Great goaltending at both ends. I believe the shots were 34-34. It was just let me see, 34-34. Look at that memory. Sorry about some things. Anyway, third period. And Philly was clinging to this 2-1 lead, and clinging was something they did really well. I mean, that team won a lot of games by winning 2-1 style games and by just grinding it out and just snuffing the other team's chances and ultimately the clock. So it was getting pretty tense there. Sort of 8 minutes left in the third period when the Oilers finally broke through with the great Glenn Anderson on a solo effort. Driving through, and this was the one he came over the blue line. He was involved in 3 huge goals in the series, and all of them involved him coming over the blue line and winding up for a slap shot. In this case, he faked the shot, went right around the defenseman, I think it was Crossman, and went and sizzled one past Hextall to tie it 2-2. The place erupted, as you might expect. And it stayed tied right into overtime, and some pretty tense plays at both ends of the ice in overtime. But ultimately, the great Yari Curry buried one. Our end of the ice, we were at the defensive end for the first and third period of basically all the games, but that meant the odd overtime, the first overtime period would be coming at us, and sometimes we'd see the winner right in our near net, and this was one such case where Gretzky held the puck along the sidewall, fed it back to Coffey in the high slot, and Coffey looked to shoot, and then fed it off to Curry, who was open at the side with the whole net, on an angle, but the whole net to hit, and hit it he did. And ended that brilliant game with a really great goal by three of the greatest players in the game. I mean, Gary Curry from Paul Coffey and Wayne Gretzky. That's how you do it.
Yep. And Bruce, I can see why this might be your favorite game that you ever attended, because I remember a while back you tweeted a screen grab from the broadcast of you and your wife in the stands.
Yeah.
Yeah, right after Curry's overtime winner. And you were also the only fan in your section wearing an Oilers jersey. So that must have been cool to catch yourself on TV after such an important goal, an overtime goal in the Stanley Cup final. And clearly you were ahead of your time as far as fans wearing jerseys at games.
Trailblazed. Nowadays, everybody except me wears a jersey.
Yeah.
to the games. They're everywhere. But back in those days, that trend was really just getting underway, and for whatever reason, in that one screen grab, there was hardly anyone that was doing that.
And the NHL's always looking for new ways to increase revenue and bring in more money. Are you surprised that the idea of selling jerseys to fans didn't become more of a phenomenon early on?
Yeah. I mean, young boys got jerseys out of their Eaton's catalog, right?
Right.
I mean, according to the legendary book, The Hockey Sweater, and that happened. But fans wearing them to games, that wasn't trendy for a long time.
Well, I mean, if you go look at any
really
game, yeah, I mean, go on YouTube and watch one of the games from the 1960s, and you won't find a single person. I was going to say, you won't find a person in the crowd not wearing a suit. It also seemed like every fan was over 40 years old in the crowd at that time too.
Yeah, mostly men, mostly white,
and not kids.
Mostly wearing suits. Yeah, mostly. Yeah, like you say, sort of executive. And I mean, if you're talking about the 60s, very reserved for large stretches. I mean, obviously when things get intense, people's blood gets up. But even in the Coliseum, people used to call it the mausoleum. They used to say, it's like a library in there. The fans are just sort of
it had a reputation as a quiet building. I think even Wayne Gretzky has said that, but it got loud in the playoffs, right?
Sure did. When it mattered most, the noise level certainly came up. And I mean, it's not like fans didn't appreciate what was going on, because we most certainly did. But it was a matter of picking your spots for when, he just scored to make it 8-2 against Colorado Rockies and Wednesday night in February. Why go crazy, right?
Especially when you knew that they were going to score a lot more that night.
Yeah.
Yeah. That might be one of 7 goals you were going to see before the night was over. So after the Oilers took a 2-0 series advantage on home ice, the series shifted back to Philadelphia for Game 3. And the Spectrum had a reputation for being a tough building to play in for opposing teams. Despite this, the Oilers jumped out to a 3-0 lead in the second period. However, the wheels fell off for the Oilers in the final 30 minutes of the game, didn't they, Bruce?
Yeah, they sure did. I mean, at this point, it actually was. It seemed too straightforward. And they came out in the first. Messier scored a shorty. Coffey scored. Anderson scored. And at this point in the series, there's been 10 goals scored by the Oilers, and all 10 of them have been scored by one of the big 5. Right? Every single goal in the series have been scored by one of Gretzky, Curry, Messier, Anderson, or Coffey for the Oilers. And once it got to 3-0, it seemed like, this maybe
smooth
it's going to be 85 again. We're in control here. And then Philly started to chip away, and basically they spent the whole rest of the series after this one chipping away. They got a couple in the second, a couple more early in the third, had an empty netter late, and all of a sudden, what it seemed, 3-0 looked like a nice lead, and all of a sudden you're on the short end of a 5-3 loss, and and there's now a whole lot of noise and emotion in the Philadelphia building, and now we've got a series.
Definitely. And moving on to Game 4, Wayne Gretzky set up Yari Curry and Kevin Lowe for a pair of first period tallies to make it 2-0 Oilers. And after those two assists, those two assists gave Gretzky a playoff leading 30 points. It was the fourth time he had reached the 30-point mark in the playoffs. And as of 1987, no one else had done it more than once. Bruce, after blowing a 3-goal lead in Game 3, the Oilers weren't about to let another one slip away as they earned a 4-1 victory and a commanding 3-1 series lead. But what fans might remember most about that game was Ron Hextall's vicious two-handed slash to the back of Kent Nielsen's legs. Mm-hmm. Did you expect that bad blood would carry over to Game 5?
Yeah, I did. Hextall was front and center in this series really right from the get-go. And in the playoffs, like he came into this series as the most talked about player on the Flyers and as a more or less considered the MVP of the Eastern Conference coming into the finals. But the Oilers got to him on this night, as you say. Curry scored from Gretzky. Lowe scored a shorthanded goal from Gretzky. Philly cut the lead. Then Randy Gregg scored a power play goal from Gretzky. And there was actually no other assists in this game. The Oilers and the team scored 3 assists in this game, and Gretzky had them all.
Point number 199, 200, and 201 of his playoff career that night.
And then Krushelnyski put it away with an unassisted marker in the third. So, but this was certainly the most complete game Edmonton played in the Spectrum in that series. And they basically got the lead and took charge. This was a game that was not as exciting as some of the other games. So as a fan, I loved it. I just thought they played really, really well and dominated the game and earned the lead and then just shut her down and took it all the way to the buzzer. And after the way they'd blown the previous game, it was very reassuring. And with the series coming home to Edmonton, there was every reason to be confident that they would close it out in Game 5 as they had done in both their 2 previous cups.
Definitely. And after earning a split on the road, the Oilers returned home to North Clans Coliseum for Game 5 with a chance to win the Stanley Cup in front of their own fans. And Bruce, the Oilers got off to another quick start. However, the Flyers battled back to deny them their Stanley Cup celebration on that night.
Yeah, this was the one. The Oilers scored on the power play early. Curry again. They stretched to 2-0. Philly scored in the last minute of the first, but the Oilers scored early in the second to stretch it to 3-1. And you're thinking, yeah, here we go. They're just going to keep scoring, and it's going to mount. And typically in these situations, the Oilers would not only win this game, but they'd win it by 3 or 4 or 5 goals. And Philly just kept chipping away, and scored twice in the second, and then one early in the third. Tocchet again, his 11th of the playoffs. Like, he was a major force, that guy. And Brian Propp had 4 primary assists for Philly, and that line with Eklund and them, they took over that game. And Edmonton, the sort of celebratory atmosphere in Edmonton, kind of didn't prepare us. Like, it seemed like, especially once it got to 3-1, that we're going to roll. And Philly just didn't knuckle under, which prior teams in that situation, we've seen, once the Oilers got a leg up on them, they were done. And these Flyers just refused to bend over.
Yeah, it seemed like every game they would battle back. And also, just to mention a correction from the previous game, it was point number 29, 30, and 31 of that year's playoffs in Game 5. And Bruce, with Game 6 back in Philadelphia, the Oilers took a 2-0 lead for the 3rd straight contest. Amazingly, though, the Flyers staged yet another comeback to even the series at 3 and force a Game 7 in Edmonton. After watching the Flyers rally to beat the Oilers 3 times in that series, how nervous were you heading into Game 7? Or did you think that the Oilers' playoff experience would give them the edge in a do-or-die game?
Oh, both of those things. They had a 2-goal lead in all 3 games they lost. Had a 3-0 lead, 2-0 leads. They also had a 2-0 lead in the series that narrowed to 2-1, made it 3-1, and that lead went away. And it was, the same kind of scoring in the series that happened within the individual games. In fact, in Game 5, we'd seen exactly that, where Philly had come from down 3-1 to win 4-3. And thinking, if that's the template,
yeah,
this is not going to be fun. And Edmonton had scored first in every game, and my thought was, it might not be the worst thing if Philly scores first, even though,
you might have got your wish.
change well, find an Edmonton Sun from that day, May 31st, 1987, and you'll find a quote from some fan named Bruce McCurdy about that first goal. That's kind of how it played out. It was so unusual. But I mean, that Game 6, Edmonton led 2-1 deep into the third period, 7 minutes left. And then Philly went wham, wham, and all of a sudden it was 3-2 and coming back. And just a zillion penalties in that game. I think the Oilers got the short straw from the officials in Game 6, to be honest. But they hadn't, they hadn't killed the monster. They hadn't played well enough to seal the deal. So ultimately, they would have to bring out their very, very best in the series finale if they wanted to kill the snake.
And Bruce, in Game 7, the Flyers opened the scoring for the first time in the series when Murray Craven scored on the power play less than 2 minutes into the first period. But after falling behind early, Edmonton mounted a comeback of their own thanks to goals from Mark Messier, Yari Curry, and Glenn Anderson as the as the Oilers beat the Flyers 3-1 and captured their third Stanley Cup championship in 4 years. Bruce, while Edmonton's speed and finesse was on full display in Game 7, they didn't score 7 or 8 goals. Instead, they dominated the Flyers in a different way than fans were maybe used to seeing from the 80s Oilers.
Yeah, that's fair. They did. I mean, they could have scored 7 or 8 goals. The Oilers hit the post, I think, 4 or 5 times in this game. Hextall was unbelievable, and he also had the horseshoes going on big time. Pucks behind him that dinged the iron, stayed out somehow. The Oilers were just having so much trouble finishing plays. But they started out, the first whistle of the game was a penalty to Messier. Second whistle of the game was a penalty to Coffey. All of a sudden, here you are, minute into the Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, and you're 3-on-5. And then Philly scored on the third play of the game. Like, that's how it started, and they were still on the power play after that. And you're going, oh, my goodness, this really could not be good.
And for the first time in the series, the Oilers were trailing.
Yeah, for in any part other than the third period, yeah. And so suddenly the challenge changed, but the Oilers rose to that challenge. And they killed the rest of that penalty, and they scored a brilliant tying goal on a 3-way passing play that Mark Messier started behind his own net and finished at the edge of the Philadelphia crease. Messier made a lead pass to Nilsson at center ice, and he made a lead pass to Anderson at center ice. Anderson came over the blue line, right to left, like he did on the previous goal I mentioned, wound up for the slap shot. But again, it was a fake shot. But this time, rather than deke the defenseman, he slipped the pass through to Kent Nilsson, who made the goal mouth pass across to Messier, who joined the rush by this time and tapped home a backhander, tied it at 1-1. And that was huge. A few minutes after that, there was a Philly chance that squeaked through Grant Fuhr and was trickling towards the goal line with 1 or 2 Flyers also trying to follow it in and power it in. And who but Marty McSorley, right winger, not defenseman at this point, materializes to clear the puck off of the goal line with the hero save. And so there was heroes that came from different parts of the team, even as the main men did most of the goal scoring. The other role players did their thing, and this was a case of that. So that kept it at 1-1, and through a combination of voodoo and sorcery, Hextall kept it 1-1 until 5 minutes to go in the second period, when Estetikinen shook a puck loose in the corner, right down below where we sat in that corner, and went to Gretzky, and he just slipped a short, sort of unassuming pass to Curry at the top of the circle, and he shrugged his shoulder, and boom, the net rippled, and it was 2-1 for Edmonton. Just kind of out of nowhere, after all the pressure they had, this goal sort of just was a quick turnover, pass shot in. Wow.
And the building must have erupted after that one.
And the building certainly did erupt after that one. And this was in the finals, this seventh game. Both Curry and Gretzky had at least 1 point in all 7 games in this finals, which was, considering it was a low-scoring series, the Oilers as a team only got 22 goals in 7 games, which that's not many for that team. Philly was a defensive force and hard to beat. But that turned out to be the game winner. But of course, the team having blown so many leads in the series by this time, the third period was a white knuckle ride almost to the very bitter end. Every time Philly crossed the blue line coming towards us, I'd sit back in my seat and you could feel the whole row, everybody just sort of sitting, taking that defensive posture, sort of sitting back. But the Oilers themselves, they didn't sit back at all. And they played in the third period of this game with a 2-1 lead against a team that kept coming back and kept coming back. I would say the Oilers played as close to a perfect period of hockey as they'd ever played to then and maybe to this day. They held the Flyers to 2 shots in that third period.
Wow.
And the Oilers peppered Hextall with 12 shots of their own. They hit a couple more posts at least. You got to watch the video to see when the posts were, but I promise you there's like at least 4 posts for Edmonton in this game.
Messier thought he had scored on one.
Messier hit the crossbar. He thought it was in. He argued with the ref while the play came the other way. There was just so many moments. And then finally the moment that almost everyone remembers is 2.5 minutes left in the third period, and Charlie Huddy makes a short pass in neutral zone to Glenn Anderson. Again, coming right to left, he comes up over the blue line. He winds up for another slap shot. It's going to be another fake. No, it's in the net. He blasted the slap shot right through Hextall. And the whole play, this was the loudest I think I ever heard Northlands in response to a specific goal. I mean, maybe the fans were louder when we won the first cup, at the sort of denouement, but in terms of the noise level just suddenly exploding, I thought the roof was going to come off. It really was. And only then, 3-1, still 2 minutes left, and the nervous Nelly fans like me were sort of going, don't make any mistakes now. You don't want to give them that one back right away. But no problem. And Philly was finally beaten. Hextall was finally beaten. And the Oilers were able to play it out to the game. One thing about Game 7, Eric, is that this was the first game in the series where the Oilers dressed 7 defensemen. This was an early Jay Woodcroft style, 11-7, where Steve Smith, he'd been kind of a bit player, the 6th, 7th guy, and he spent some games in the press box. And when he was in the press box, Edmonton seemed to invariably lose. And I think that year they were 14-1 in games that Smith played, and 2-4 in games that he didn't. And of course, he didn't because there was injuries, so he was in and out. But by Game 7, Sather was going, even though all of our other 6 guys are ready, I want Steve as well. Let's get him out there. So they ran with 7 defensemen in that game. Just reading the list here: Paul Coffey, Randy Gregg, Charlie Huddy. This was Martin Messor was still playing forward at this time. We can't count him. Kevin Lowe, Craig Muni, Ray Hortzlane, and Steve Smith. Steve Smith was +2 in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. Steve Smith, the GOAT of previous year's playoff, and one of the great GOAT moments in sports history, to be frank.
Right.
Baseball fans will talk about the Merkle boner and the Snodgrass muff and the bucket muff and stuff like that. But that was a real GOAT moment. I'm not talking greatest of all time.
Yeah.
GOAT.
The old term for it.
Steve was the in the lineup and doing what he did. Playing big, playing mean and tough against a big, tough, mean opponent. And holding his ground and giving him nothing. And we don't have time on ice in this game. It'd be kind of interesting to see that. That we didn't quite have that then. But he was, certainly part of the rotation and held the fort. And then, of course, the famous moment came in the cup celebration when John Ziegler handed the cup to Captain Wayne Gretzky, and he immediately passed it over to Steve Smith. And that was just such a fitting moment. The smile on Smith's face as he raised that cup was just warm your heart.
Yeah. I mean, after everything he had been through the year before, on his birthday, in the biggest game of the season that ultimately ended up with
that point.
Yeah. And that ended the Oilers' dream of winning a third straight Stanley Cup. I mean, for him to have this moment a year later and be handed the cup first by Wayne Gretzky, I think that it spoke to Gretzky's leadership to recognize that Smith was the right player to hand it to first. And also, although Smith probably carried that burden somewhat for the rest of his career and maybe to this day, it might have exercised some demons at least.
Very much so. I mean, that you could see the exorcism taking place when he was raising that cup. And I mean, Wayne singled him out, and rightfully so. I mean, nowadays they kind of have a pecking order of experienced players and so on that they go through. But this was a case where the right guy that needed to lift that thing got it right away.
Absolutely.
And that was, and the roar from the crowd at that moment was the sound for sore ears, I guess, would be the that's why, the sight for sore eyes, but only that sound. Anyway, it was a joyous moment, and he was officially welcomed back into the pantheon of good guys. Steve wound up winning 3 cups here. Yeah, and he was a big time player on those teams.
And Bruce, looking at the Oilers' statistics from the 1987 playoffs, Wayne Gretzky led the league in playoff scoring with 34 points, including 11 points in the final. His 29 assists were also more than anyone else had total points in the playoffs that year. Yari Curry led the league in playoff goals with 15. Mark Messier and Glenn Anderson each finished top 5 in playoff scoring as well with 28 and 27 points respectively. And in goal, Grant Fuhr posted a stellar 14-5 record. Bruce, in an interview with NHL.com in 2017, Gretzky called the 1986-87 Oilers the most talented team from their dynasty. As someone who was a fan through the glory years and watched all of those cups, do you agree that the 1987 edition was the most skilled Oilers team in franchise history?
Yeah, I think I do. Some of the talent was maturing. And the boys that were 23 when they won the first cup in '84, as all 4 of the superstar forwards were, and Coffey and Fuhr were younger than that. They were all 26 by then, and they just had, I think, a little more complete games, and maybe they weren't even necessarily better scorers, but they had more depth to their games, and that team was absolutely lethal at converting chances. I meant to talk about this earlier, just about the regular season, but just a couple of statistics about that team that won the President's Trophy with 106 points. That was a 21-team NHL, and the Oilers finished tied for 16th with New Jersey Devils, Mickey Mouse team, and shots per game. Like, you think offensive team, they're going to have a lot of shots, right? They're always going to be peppering pucks at the net. They're going to, they're going to mount those shots up. The Oilers were 16th out of 21, tied for 16th in shots or shots per game, which is how they presented on the NHL page. Well, guess where they were for goals? I don't have to.
Won by some margin.
Number 1. Oilers 372 goals, 4.65 per game. Second in the league was for goals was LA Kings and Calgary Flames, each 318. So just under 4 per game. The Oilers had 54 more goals than any other NHL team, despite the fact they were in the bottom 3rd in the league in shots on goal.
Right.
but their shooting percentage was just through the roof. The Oilers shooting percentage that year was 15.8%. The team shooting percentage, 15.8%, was as part of a streak of 7 straight years, ending with the Gretzky departure, where the team shot over 15% in every one of those years. This was the first year in 6 where they didn't score 400 goals. The defense was starting to come on. But their ability to convert, the 15.8% shooting percentage, second in the league was 12.9, Philly, almost 3% lower than the Oilers. 21st and last in the league was 11.2. I mean, the team that was second was much closer to 21st than they were to first. I mean, the Oilers were just in a completely different league in terms of how they turned opportunities with the puck. Not necessarily into shots, but when they did shoot, into goals. And sometimes, they make that extra pass, and the extra pass didn't work, well, there would be no shot. But when the extra pass did work, there would be no save.
Yeah. I mean, that was a team that you didn't want to trade chances with, but it seemed to happen more often than not. And the Oilers had so many dangerous attackers that even though they didn't get as many scoring chances as their opponent, they made the ones that they got count.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they got Oilers in the regular season. All 5 of their cup years, they were outshot. They had fewer shots than their opponents.
Yeah.
And, you think nowadays in terms of shot analytics and so on, that teams with high shot shares should have high goal shares. And certainly that's true now. And obviously some things have changed from the time of dynasties and dinosaurs. It's a whole different time. In the parity era, shot shares probably do mean have a greater meaning. But one of the
completely different style of hockey now, too, though, right?
Always skeptical a little bit of shot share analytics is that I saw these Oilers and we didn't have the individual Corsi and so on, nothing like that. And for the team, we didn't have Corsi or Fenwick or scoring shot. All we had was shots and goals. But the Oilers were so mediocre in the one and so completely, utterly dominant, winning the league goal scoring title for team, by sometimes 100 goals in a year. In this case, 54 goals in the season. And they were, it was just a different way of doing it. And evidence that, there's more than one way to win than just simply dominating and doing, the Scotty Bowman Detroit era where we'll outshoot you 30-20 and we'll beat you 3-2. It's, the Oilers were, we'll trade chances with you. We'll even give you the first chance. We're confident Grant will make the save, and we're also confident we'll come down on the counter and kill you.
Yeah. Without a doubt. All right, we're going to discuss the 1987 Canada Cup now. So just 3 months after the Oilers celebrated their Stanley Cup victory, Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Glenn Anderson, Paul Coffey, and Grant Fuhr were all selected to play for Team Canada in the 1987 Canada Cup. Canada finished first in the round-robin standings with a 3-0-2 record and defeated Czechoslovakia 5-3 in the semifinal to advance to the best-of-3 final against the Soviet Union. And with 12 future Hall of Famers on Team Canada, including all 5 superstars from the Oilers, this was almost certainly the most star-studded Canadian squad to ever play on the international stage. However, the Soviets were every bit Canada's equal in this tournament. Bruce, did it seem like these two nations were destined to meet in the final before the tournament even started?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The Russians, Soviets, they still were at that time. They were a dominant team. They had the famous green unit with the KLM line, Krutov, Larionov, Makarov, and then the defensemen, Fetisov and Kasatonov, who eventually wound up hating each other and not ever speaking to one another. But at this time, that unit, and they played them as a unit, a 5-man unit, and they were gloriously good. And in fact, that same team went on to win the Olympic gold medal in Calgary a few months later in the '88 Olympics. I was fortunate enough to actually see them play in one of those games
Oh, wow.
at the Corral, and uh, that was a dominant team that. They weren't quite yet there. These guys were just still coming up through the junior team. Pavel Bure, Alexander McGillney, Sergei Fedorov. I mean, they were turning out some mighty fine hockey players on an ongoing basis. And they still played a foreign game, but it wasn't quite so foreign as what we'd seen in the Summit Series. And you'll be hearing lots about the Summit Series this month for its 50th anniversary from 1972. And at that time, it was like the two teams spoke two different languages on the ice. And by '87, there was enough of a hybrid, even though Russians hadn't played in the NHL, but they played against each other enough times that at least they could sort of speak each other's language. There was some overlap, but they were still very, very different. 25 years later, so 10 years ago from now, I did an analysis of the video, and I did zone entries, just using modern methods to try and tease out some of these differences.
Oh, wow.
And the Russians were very much attack the zone in possession of the puck. None of this dump it in and go and get it back. And I wrote a post on it. You can probably Google it, Vintage Hockey Through a Modern Lens, and then some subtitle about Canada and Russia and the Canada Cup, and just trying to analyze it with modern metrics. So we just did a video review. David Staples, my colleague at the Cult of Hockey, also did a project on that series at that time. And the KLM line, like they only came in over the blue line in possession. Like way over 90% of their zone entries were under control. And this was a time zone entries themselves were really just starting to be analyzed in this business of zone entries with control as opposed to giving up control. Dumping it in, playing dump and thump, try and get it back on the in the deep in the other team's end off the forechecking and turnovers versus just skilling it in over the line and skilling it from there. Might take 15 passes the way the Russians played with all these little drop passes and fancy perimeters. They played ticky-tacky, what Barcelona did in soccer. That was a little bit of the Russian style in hockey. Whereas Canada, they weren't quite the rugged individualists that were on that 1972 team, with Phil Esposito and Bobby Clark and players that were sort of front and center on that team. The Canadian team had a tremendous amount of skill, as you say, the 5 Hall of Fame Oilers, of course, the great Mario Lemieux, in one of his few appearances for Team Canada.
Yeah.
And actually winding up on the same line with Wayne Gretzky in a hockey fan's dream.
It's a shame those two never got to play together more. I mean, I think the only other time they were ever teammates in their career was in the 1997 All-Star game, which, isn't the same even close to being teammates for Team Canada. But just because of the unfortunate health situation with Mario Lemieux, they were denied that opportunity several more times. It just would have been incredible as their careers went on to see those two have the chance to play together more frequently.
Yeah, Mario was, if I recall right, his next appearance for Team Canada was in the 2002 Olympics when they finally won the gold medal in Salt Lake City.
Yes, because he was unable to play in 91 and 96.
Yeah, and then 98 Olympics as well.
Yeah.
He may have been
retired.
That might have been retired at that time.
Yeah.
And Wayne was on the verge of retirement. And by 02, of course, Wayne was gone, but Mario was still there, and he made a famous dummy play on a pass from Chris Pronger to Paul Kariya that produced a huge goal for Canada in the gold medal game, where Mario let the pass seemed to be for him, and he let it go through him.
To Paul Kariya.
To Kariya, yeah. But in the 87 Canada Cup, he was just at the height of his, just really burgeoning into the height of his powers. He would win the scoring championship the next year, breaking Gretzky's 7-year stranglehold.
Still just 21 in that tournament.
still win it again the year after that. But in that tournament, he played with the master, and he learned at the foot of the master, and he was pretty masterful in his own right. With I think it was 11 goals and 7 assists in the Canada Cup, and second in scoring only to the Great One.
And, just on a side note, one of the reasons I'm most disappointed that Canada didn't, or that the NHL players in general didn't go to the Olympics in 2018 was that I would have loved Connor McDavid to have the opportunity to play with Sidney Crosby while they were both still close to their peak abilities, and have McDavid learn under Crosby, similar to the way that Mario did with Wayne in '87.
Yeah, no, that would have been good for sure. But the last 2 Olympics now have the game's turned in a different way, and hopefully they'll get the World Cup back. They did have the World Cup in 2016, of course, but they stashed McDavid on that Young Stars team.
I know.
So didn't get to play with the best of Canada. He got sequestered on a different structure that they were trying, and they were trying to make an 8-team tournament when they only really had 6 powerhouse countries. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of what they did. But it was the unfortunate offshoot was McDavid, even at 19, as he was in 2016, was a very dominant player in that tournament. But we never did see him with Sid.
Yeah. Well, I mean, despite his rookie season being basically cut in half with a broken collarbone, McDavid finished 3rd in the league in points per game average as a rookie. So if there hadn't been that Young Stars team, I'm almost certain that he would have earned a spot on Team Canada by merit.
Yeah, he would have been Mario Lemieux in '87 all over again, young but so
even younger,
so as not to be denied.
Yeah,
or Wayne in '81,
right,
where he was 20
and led the tournament in scoring.
He played 4 Canada Cups, Gretzky, and he led all 4 of them in scoring. But that's what he did.
Just remarkable. And Bruce, there's been some great rivalries on the international stage over the years. Definitely in the past 2 decades, the United States has obviously been Canada's greatest rival in both men's and women's hockey. But during the 1970s and 1980s, Canada and the Soviet Union undoubtedly had the most intense rivalry in international hockey.
No question. And I mean, the only one that I would say came close was Soviet Union against Czechoslovakia in the 70s. That was a dynamite rivalry. It was they hated one another, like they were geographic neighbors, kind of like Canada and the U.S. were. But they had a recent history of disagreement and strife. I mean, the Prague Spring in 1968 that led to Jaromir Jagr's choice of number for his whole career, by the way, was just the moment that kind of put it on the boil. Those 2 teams met in the '69 World Championship 2 times, and Czechoslovaks won both games, and they were just dynamite. They were just given everything they had to win those games. A super high intensity, pure. You could see a hatred, war on ice, as it was described then. And the Canada-Russia or Canada-Soviet Union series in '72 had many elements of that as well. I would say by '87, some of those edges had been filed down to mutual respect. And I mean, they each hated and feared each other. But I think there was also some, just shared respect for how good they were, and certainly the on the talent level, that '87 Team Canada, I would suggest was well clear of the '72 Summit Series team, even as that had all the top players in the NHL at that time, other than the injured Bobby Orr. Well, in '87, Wayne Gretzky wasn't injured, neither was Mario Lemieux. And then, as you say, Bork, Coffey, Larry Murphy was on that team, Messier, Anderson, Howardchuk, Fuhrer, on and on, like lots of big time star players. And it was a high skill 2 teams, and they played a high octane game. All 3 games in that final series were 6-5.
Yeah. I mean, when more than half of the roster goes on to be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, kind of tells you the level of team that you're watching.
Yeah, they were unreal good, and they were in deep. It was all they could do to scrape out that series. They were in many ways fortunate to come out on top.
And there was more familiarity between the Soviets, too. That was an obvious advantage as well, right? I mean, it's not like the Canadian squad played together on a consistent basis. There were some teammates in that tournament, but by and large, it was an all-star team of the best players in the NHL put together compared to a Soviet team that had played together for years and years.
Yeah, well, certainly the Russian, the center core of the Soviet Union national team came from the Central Red Army team, now known as CSKA Moscow and KHL. But that team, the entire Green Unit, which arguably were the 5 best players in Russia, played for Central Red Army on the league team. Never mind they were intimately familiar with each other because they played 50 games a year together, not just, they didn't just sort of meet up a week before the World Championships.
Yeah.
They were teammates the entire time. I mean, Central Red Army, I mean, think about it, Soviet Union. I mean, you want to talk about a team that was built through the draft. I'll take Central Red Army from the Soviet Union. I mean, they wanted a player. He showed up in Red Army the next year.
And they played some exhibition games in Edmonton, too, didn't they, in the 1980s?
Yeah, in the 70s and 80s, they did. Yeah, I saw an exhibition game between Russian national team and the WHA Oilers. I think it would have been 78. And this was the team that, they had Yakushev, they had Petrov, Kharlamov, Mikhailov, that whole line. They had Tretiak, although he didn't play, unfortunately, in the game that I saw in Edmonton. He played against the Jets the next day because they wanted to beat the league champs. And they beat the Oilers 3-2, and they beat the Jets 3-2. But they were darn good games. And it was a real thrill to see that whole team. They were so different. We went down to watch, and we were hardly alone, like probably 10,000 people watched the pregame warm-up.
Right.
Because the Russians were famous for doing pregame warm-ups that were just totally different from everything that, none of this line rushes and everybody takes a slap shot on the goalie from the top of the face-off circle. They were doing all kinds of inventive stuff, and most of it they actually got from Lloyd Percival, Bible, the hockey handbook that was written like in 1950 or so. That they'd gotten from Canada, and they'd taken it to heart, all the drills and stuff that he did, and they added in, they did land training, dry land training. That was a big thing then. Who trains off the ice? Don't you just put your skates on and play? They just
ahead of their time for sure.
Yes, very much so. And so there was an element of that. I know Oilers did play and beat top Soviet team 4-3. I think it was around 83. Gretzky had a pair of goals, and I think Messier and Anderson each scored and had a couple of apples, and it was a fun game for everybody, and it was all the rising powerhouse Oilers could do to come out on top of that. And then they played them again when they were champs and got beat. So those international games were very much in flavor. There used to be touring teams most years where 2 touring teams would come from Russia and play series of games against NHL teams, and they'd all be on TV, and they'd get great ratings. Like, people just ate up that international.
Oh, I can imagine.
No, I did. I still do to some degree, but it's now very much a back burner compared to what it was then, where it says, international hockey's tournament time, and not World Junior, but these are the pros playing each other. And anyway, it was a different time for the game, for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about game 1 of the best-of-3 final now at the Montreal Forum. Trailing 4-1 in the second period, Canada rallied to tie the game 4-4, setting up a wild finish that required extra time. Unfortunately, the home side came out on the wrong side of that score in an otherwise very entertaining game, Bruce.
Yeah, it was, and trying to remember, was it COVID? It was the guy who scored the winning goal in overtime, and it was about 6 minutes into overtime, and he just roofed a great shot from uh, and just beat Fuhr clean over the blocker and into the roof of the net from the sort of between the circles kind of shot. Number 30, I think, right hand shot for Russia. I can't remember his name offhand.
Near the top of the circles, right?
Wasn't Kaminsky, but Kaminsky, he did his damage. He scored a brilliant goal in that series as well. But and anyway, just like that, it seemed like Canada had come from behind. They got the game under control, and all of a sudden, boom, they lost, and now they're not only have to beat the Russians, they got to beat them twice.
Mm-hmm.
Can't lose in either of the games. They're clearly behind the eight ball after that game one defeat.
And Gretzky had the game-winning, go-ahead goal, I should say, with about a minute and a half remaining. But the Russians responded, I think, with 22 seconds left on the clock to tie it.
Yeah, I don't have the summary in front of me. Was that the one? Kaminsky got this fantastic tying goal in one of the games. I think it might have been. Anyway, it was all of these games. One team would put a nose in front, and the other team would have the answer for it. And it was 5-5 with the game on the line. And two of them went to overtime. The third one went to minute and a half to play. 5-5, 5-5.
Mm-hmm.
Like it wasn't like 6-3 and they got a couple late ones to make it close. This was everything on the line down the stretch.
So after a heartbreaking loss in Game 1, Canada needed to win Game 2, as you mentioned, at Copps Coliseum in Hamilton to stay alive in the tournament. And this game proved to be a thrilling back-and-forth affair by two incredibly talented hockey teams. Wayne Gretzky has even called it the best game he ever played. Bruce, as a hockey historian and huge Gretzky fan, do you agree that this was perhaps the Great One's single greatest performance?
I think you can make a strong case that it was his greatest international game with 5 assists. I think they were all primary assists too. The last 3 to Mario got the hat trick, including the winner. I can tell at 10:07 of the second overtime. Like they played 30 minutes of overtime where a single goal against Grant Fuhr was lights out and a 2-0 sweep against in the series. But Gretzky and Lemieux were indomitable. This was, I think, the game where Keenan put them together for keeps, and they were just. Mario was such a great finisher, and of course Gretzky was setup man, non-parial, and they clicked, and when they did, they were pretty unstoppable, and then finally they were able to, rather than the Russians coming back to tie it up again. Once they scored in overtime, of course, the game was over. So this was true sudden death.
Double overtime, in fact.
Yeah, 30 minutes of overtime. Halfway through the second overtime period before they finally were able to lift home the winner. And a thrilling game. It really had a whole lot.
Yeah, and
way better than Game 3, honestly.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it might be Gretzky's greatest game on the international stage. There are probably countless examples from his NHL career that you could point to, but from the interview that I watched with Gretzky talking about this game, the reason why he singled it out as perhaps the best he ever played was because of the level of competition that they were going up against, where it was as good of a team as he had ever played in his career. And to put up 5 assists against them in a do-or-die game where Canada was on the verge of elimination, I think that played a big part in why he feels that it was maybe his best hockey game.
Yeah, well, it's hard to argue. I mean, he had, I think, 21 points in that Canada Cup, and I think that's probably the record for that tournament.
Yeah. I think it's also the record for points in a best-on-best international tournament altogether.
Of any type? Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, 21 points in, 9 games they played? But this was the high watermark for sure with all those primary assists.
Mm-hmm. And after splitting the first two games by identical 6-5 scores, Canada fell behind 3-0 early in Game 3. But Bruce, once again, they fought their way back into the game. And in the end, the two best players in the game, Gretzky and Mario Lemieux, created one of the most memorable plays in Canadian sports history.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a face-off in Canada's end with, I think it was 1:36 to go. And they sent out three centers, Gretzky, Lemieux, and Dale Hawerchuk. And Hawerchuk, they won the puck and they broke out of their zone. And Hawerchuk's key involvement was a play where he kind of picked off one of the would-be back checkers from Russia in a play that any self-respecting Soviet fan would tell you should have been a penalty, and they were probably right. But this was 5-5 with 2 minutes left. You're going to call a penalty away from the puck? Not any referee I've ever seen. I mean, welcome to North American reffing, there are Russians. And so it was Hudson Bay rules, and Hawerchuk got away with that. And all of a sudden, it was it looked like a 2-on-1 with Larry Murphy and Gretzky. But Gretzky had the puck on the left side. Most 2-on-1s he would be on the right and passing across to the left to Curry. That's how I always seemed to be doing that. But in this one, he had the puck on the left side. Murphy was charging up the ice to his right, and all of a sudden Mario comes up into the rush as the third man, 3-on-1. I mean, it's a big mistake to give up a 3-on-1, even if one guy was interfered with. And Wayne had a choice between passing the puck to Larry Murphy or Mario Lemieux. Tough choice. He made the right one. He sent it back to big number 66, and he shrugged his shoulders, top corner. 1:26 to play. Dan Kelly, I still remember his call of that. This was maybe his high water mark as an announcer in the Cops Coliseum in Hamilton. They made it 6-5. And of course, this wasn't overtime, so they still had 86 tenths seconds to go through. But it felt, in many ways, it felt like the Henderson goal in '72. Once they finally got that lead, 6-5, that was going to be it. And in both cases, that was just played out to the end. But the dramatics of that goal, and to have those two guys. Both of them to be, like 80 players, one scores on a pass from the other. You couldn't really ask for a better or more fitting ending than that. And they didn't play so well in Game 3 as they had in Game 2. And this was a game Game 3, where they fought from behind a big deficit that they got some scoring from secondary players. Rick Tocchet, another great player that was further down the lineup. I remember him pounding home one of the goals to get him kind of back in the game. And this was very much a team effort. But after, the team had a very, very dodgy start, and they were able to overcome it. And when push came to shove, I think Wayne only had 2 assists in this. The second one was the Cup winner.
Yeah. And as we briefly talked about before, for the third straight Canada Cup, Gretzky led the 1987 tournament in scoring with 21 points in only 9 games. He was obviously named tournament MVP, deservingly so. Bruce, this was Gretzky's finest moment on the international stage, and I think we can surely say one of the biggest moments of his entire career, too.
Yeah. Well, this was, he was at the pinnacle, and really this was a multi-year string. But consider that in both 84, 85, and then again in 87, 88, the several members of the Edmonton Oilers, and I think there was 8 of them on the 84 Canada Cup team, because they had Randy Gregg and Kevin Lowe on that team, that won the Cup, won the other Cup, then won the first Cup again in 12 months.
Yeah.
Stanley Cup, Canada Cup, Stanley Cup. I mean, these are intense, long seasons. with extra, high intensity hockey in September. I mean, they just won the cup in May, and they had to come back, and it took them a while to get dialed in, as is typical with Canada and international tournaments of all sorts. But they had they managed to get it done in '84. They beat the Russians in semifinal in one single sudden death game, and then they beat the Swedes in the final. The '84 Canada Cup final game was played in Northlands Coliseum in Edmonton. I had the pleasure of attending that game, so I actually saw all three of those cups in '84, '84, '85 awarded, whereas in '87, '88 I was had to watch the one on TV, but the other two were also in Edmonton, all home wins, right? The four Gretzky Cups were all home wins, so particularly memorable. But for Gretzky himself, he set up the cup-winning goal in the Stanley Cup, and then he set up the cup-winning goal in the Canada Cup, and that was just Wayne being Wayne, setting up goals.
And Bruce, my final one for you tonight, because of the amount of speed and skill on both the Canadian and Soviet teams, the 1987 Canada Cup has been called by many the best hockey that's ever been played. I don't think that anything will ever touch the 1972 Summit Series in terms of importance, but where does this tournament rank in your lifetime as a hockey fan?
Well, as a hockey spectacle, very high, very high. I mean, you're talking about those 12 Hall of Famers on Team Canada, and I talked about all the superstars on the Russian Green unit. They had many more good players than that, of course, on that team. But I think in terms of just raw talent on display, it's pretty hard to find higher than that. And it was, and this was, right on the heels of this '87 Stanley Cup final, which I consider to be one of the very greatest Stanley Cup finals in my lifetime. The '87 Stanley Cup. I mean, the game of hockey was at a very high point after struggling in many respects through the '70s. So rapid was the expansion. There were 6 teams in 1966-67, major league teams, and there was 32 of them in 1974-75, just 8 years later. And I mean, the talent was spread pretty thinly. Remember them used to saying, tonight the Oilers are playing Rosaire Paymont and the Chicago Cougars. Okay, that's their poster boy. Okay, but there was plenty of poster boys in both the '87 Stanley Cup Finals and the Canada Cup Finals. It was a high water mark for hockey, and especially for players and fans in this city.
Oh, without a doubt. Bruce, I just want to thank you again for being on the show tonight and sticking with me for nearly 2.5 hours of hockey talk. It's always great hearing these stories. You're one of my favorite guests because of the great information you can provide and the storytelling from what was not just the best period of time in Oilers history, but one of the most entertaining times in the history of the game. So it's always great to hear these stories, and hopefully we can do this again sometime and talk more about the great glory days of the past.
Yeah, well, these were many of the greatest players of all time. We were very blessed to have so many of them in one place, sort of peaking together at the same time. I personally so very blessed to walk into my season tickets when I did and hold them throughout the '80s and see almost all of these games in person, and I was just soaking it up, as you probably tell. And a lot of it's stuck. Like a lot of these memories, they seem fresh, even though they were 35 years ago. That we're marking the 35 anniversary, I guess, of that Canada Cup. So.
Right. And I sort of inherited becoming a Wayne Gretzky fan because my dad got me a Gretzky jersey for my first birthday in 1990. But obviously, because of the time that I was born, I missed out on the entire Gretzky's entire time in Edmonton. I was alive for the 5th and final Stanley Cup, but I'm hoping he wasn't on the team by then. And I'm hopeful that we'll get to see at least one Stanley Cup during the 2020s. It'll never compare to what they did in the 80s, but this city, after 3 decades, is ready for another championship, and we might just see it next spring.
Yeah, we're poised in better position than we've been in a very long time. There's been lots of down years since, but still, Edmonton's been very fortunate on balance over all these years with all the Hart Trophy winners and champion teams, scoring champions, so on that we've had. We've had a uh, very good time of it by and large, even with the decade of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're very definitely coming out of that in a team with a nice core group. Maybe not quite as many great players as there was in that mid '80s team, but still a couple of real transcendent talents, and
Yeah.
they're a joy to watch.
And when you have players like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl at the apex of their abilities, and without a doubt, the deepest team around them since they've been in the NHL, this is the time to make it count and really take a good shot at winning a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, let's hope so.
All right, Bruce, thanks again. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks very much, Eric. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, so for Bruce McCurdy, I'm Eric Friesen. This has been the 99 Forever podcast. We're out.